Hello, my dear Franken-friends, and welcome to Spookyou, your one-stop shop for all things ghastly and ghoulish. I'm your host, Barnabas Vixen. Now, none of you have asked for it, and so we decided we'd deliver. Today, we're bringing you the entirety of the People Think I'm a Serial Killer series by CarlB1961 to you in a single video. That's right! No more pesky sponsors interrupting the most crucial moments. No more bothersome intros for you to skip, except for this one. No more annoying YouTube playlist platypuses giving you a hard time while you're just trying to enjoy this enticing series. Uninterrupted and in our most basic quality, we present to you People Think I'm a Serial Killer. It's Far Worse Than That by CarlB1961. Take it away, vivacious voiceover virtuoso. And I'll see all of you later. I won't tell you my name. If you watch the news regularly, you probably already know it. I'm rather famous right now, or perhaps more appropriately, infamous. The media has been covering my story for months, and I've been in all the major newspapers. My name is a source of heated debate. People discuss me in the office break room and at bars and restaurants. Housewives scare each other with stories of me when they get together for lunch, embellishing my crimes, consulting their imaginations to conjure up the most lurid details they can come up with to get a rise out of their friends. I've been featured on all the big real-life crime shows, and various esteemed professionals in the psychiatric field and criminal profilers have sat down with talk show hosts and major network news pundits to offer their own insights and theories into what makes me tick, what caused me to become what I am. I won't keep you in suspense. I'll just come out and say it. I'm what most people would call a serial killer. I was apprehended 10 months ago after committing 40 murders in 10 states over an 8-year period, and am currently locked up in a federal prison. My murder trial is in progress, and the odds are not in my favor. There's a ton of evidence against me, and chances are good that I'll be convicted and probably sentenced to death. People are already comparing me to the likes of Bundy, Gacy, Gein, and Dahmer. I have to be escorted into the courthouse with armed guards and wearing a bulletproof vest because of death threats made against me by the grieving relatives of my victims. The outside of the courthouse is a circus whenever we arrive. Various journalists, spectators, curiosity seekers, freaks, you name it, are crowded around the front of the building in the hundreds. My trial is being televised, and my lawyer has told me it's the media event of the decade. Like I'm supposed to be proud of that. I couldn't care less. Yes, I did commit those murders, all 40 of them. I won't deny it. No, I'm not a sociopath or a psychotic. I didn't hear voices telling me to do it. I didn't do it because God told me to do it in a dream to cleanse the world of sin. I didn't do it because I was trying to impress a celebrity or my dog told me to. I didn't do it for political reasons or try to incite a race war like Manson did either. I did it because I had to. Someone had to do it. I killed 40 people, but none of them were human. Maybe I should back up a bit and explain. I guess you can say I had a pretty rough beginning. I know that's the standard excuse most serial killers use to try and justify their behavior, but it's the truth. It all started when I was 8. That was when I lost my vision. My childhood was a living hell. I grew up dirt poor, on the wrong side of the tracks, as they say. My old man was a no-good drunken redneck who had trouble holding down a steady job because of his alcoholism. He wasn't articulate enough to express his frustrations with his life situation in words. So instead, he used his fist and hands on me and my mother to do it. For her part, my mother was a spineless asswipe who would rather stick with a man who routinely used her and her only child as a punching bag than leave him and try raising me on her own. I often showed up to school with bruises and an occasional black eye, but none of the teachers did shit about it because my family was poor white trash on welfare, so why should they give a fuck? To her credit, my school principal did try to get the police involved a time or two, but whenever they or social services showed up, my dad would always weasel his way out of it with some excuse or another, and my mom always backed him up. And then, after they left, he would beat the shit out of me for trying to start up trouble, as if I had any say in the principal calling them. It all came to a head one summer day when I was 8. I was out in the garage playing with my old man's tools like most little kids will, pretending I was a plumber or a repairman or whatever. My dad stumbled in, drunk, saw his tools scattered around, and decided the most reasonable course of action was to pick up a pipe wrench and then proceed to bash my head in with it. I blacked out. When I woke up from my coma 3 days later in the hospital, it was still black. At first, I thought I was having trouble opening my eyes, or I had a bandage over them. And when I put up my hands to feel them and I realized there was no bandage covering my eyes and they were wide open, I began to freak out. The doctors explained to me that the vision center of my brain had been severely damaged in the beating and that I would never see again. My dad went to prison for that. He was sentenced to 25 years for attempted murder, but only served 2.5 before someone who took an exception to child beaters stuck a shiv in his throat in the cafeteria. In my opinion, the bastard got off way too easy. He was dead, and I was sentenced to a lifetime of being blind. I guess having to take care of a blind kid was too much of a hassle for my mom because she packed her bags and took off before I was even discharged from the hospital. I never, pardon the pun, saw her again. After that, I went to live with my maternal grandparents. They were a decent enough couple, but they weren't much better off than my folks had been. My grandma wanted to send me to a special school for blind kids where they teach them how to adjust to life in the world after losing their sight, teach them Braille, that kind of thing. But those places cost money, and that was something my grandparents didn't have much of to spare. Still, my childhood with them was a major improvement compared to the living hell I had endured before. They raised me as best as they could and tried to educate me on their own. But they were country people and, well, not to sound ungrateful, not particularly bright. And it's not like I could attend a regular school in my condition. My grandpa died in a car accident caused by a drunk driver when I was 11, and then my grandma tried to raise me on her own until she died of a stroke when I was 15. After that, I was sent to live in a state-funded group home, which was just a fancy modern term for an orphanage. There, my life returned to a living hell for the next 3 years as I endured abuse from the other kids, bullies taking advantage of my disability, while the overworked, underpaid staff, once again, pardon the pun, turned a blind eye. The administration tried to set me up with a foster family on several occasions, but I guess most people don't find the idea of taking in a blind teenager very appealing. When I was 18 and legally an adult, the group home kicked me out, leaving me to fend for myself. Isn't bureaucracy great? Which was no easy task for a blind guy with no real education or skills. I did the only thing I can think of. I turned to panhandling. I'd stand on the sidewalk with a cardboard sign a store owner had made for me out of pity, begging anyone who walked by, getting by on the charity of others. As I was to find out the hard way, in this day and age, a lot of people don't have much charity to spare, or compassion. I've been spit upon, insulted, called names, told to get a real job, and accused of faking my blindness for sympathy. A couple of times I even got beat up, I guess just for kicks. It was pretty much just like it had been in the group home. Hell, for all I know, it even might have been the same kids. One hard lesson I've learned in my life is that some people never change. If you're born an asshole, you're gonna die an asshole. There are some people who still have a spark of kindness in their hearts, though, and I usually made just enough during the day to buy a meal with. Mostly I slept outside using the narrow space behind a dumpster for shelter, bundling up in trash and old newspapers to stay warm. A few times, someone was kind enough to guide me to a nearby homeless shelter so I wouldn't freeze to death in sub-zero weather. That was pretty much how my life went for the next 10 years. I got pretty bitter about it after a while, wondering if this was as good as it was ever going to get for me. If I would spend the rest of my life a blind beggar on a street corner, ignored by most of society, unable to even see the contemptuous expressions on the faces of those who walked by me, sleeping rough and having to forage through trash cans, eating the stuff others threw away on a particularly bad day when my earnings were pretty light. I started to wish I had never woken from that coma, that my dad had just killed me. I started to contemplate suicide, thinking about just stepping into the road anytime I heard the sound of an approaching engine. And I might have done it too. Until I met him. The doctor. He came up to me one day after I'd just been pretty aggressively told off by businessmen. You learn to identify people based upon their smells and the way they talk. This guy's smell was a combination of expensive aftershave and briefcase leather, and he spoke to me in the arrogant, cultured, self-righteous tone of someone too important to waste their time or money on unwashed street trash like myself. Who basically told me I was a leech upon society who didn't contribute anything, and that I should drop dead. After the businessman walked away, I heard someone else approach me and just stand there. I could sense them looking at me. "You get that a lot?" a new voice asked me. It sounded like an older man, probably in his 50s. I could detect a faint chemical smell to his clothes, almost medicinal in nature. "Most days, yeah," I replied with a shrug. He began asking me questions: how old I was, how had I lost my sight, how long had I been on the streets. I answered his questions, which were pretty standard questions I got asked all the time, by those who bothered to speak to me at all. "I might be able to help you," he told me. I figured he was just another do-gooder, offering to buy me a hot meal and spare 20 minutes listening to me share my tale of woe, or some religious type wanting to give me an uplifting speech about how Jesus hadn't abandoned me and the Lord test us all, and that when my trials were over I would see again in the kingdom of heaven. I'd been fed that type of bullshit before, mostly by super pious middle-class churchgoers in their expensive Sunday clothes on their way to breakfast after having fulfilled their weekly duty and given lip service to God. And most of them never spared me a dime either. They probably didn't tip their server either. That's something else I learned about people during my time as a panhandler. Most of the people who care, or claim to, only care as long as they don't have to pay for it. Hypocrisy at its finest. Sorry if I sound bitter. My experiences being homeless made me pretty cynical. "Yeah," I told him dryly. "How so? You gonna give me a new pair of eyes?" "It's not your eyes that are the problem. Based on what you've told me, it's your brain that's the source of the problem." He then got down to brass tacks and asked me a question that gave me pause. "How would you like to regain your sight?" I was taken aback a little bit by what he had said. "What the fuck are you talking about?" "I'm talking about potentially restoring your sight," he said. "Who are you, anyway?" "Oh, forgive me. I haven't properly introduced myself. My name is Carl Steiner. Dr. Carl Steiner." "That's so," I replied, feeling a flash of intrigue when he mentioned the word doctor. "Yes, MD, PhD. To be more specific, I'm a neurosurgeon." "You mean a brain surgeon?" "Well, to put it in layman's terms, yes." He paused for a moment. "You look hungry. Why don't we go get something to eat, and then afterwards we can discuss this in depth." "Are you picking up the tab?" I asked. "But of course." He had me hooked. I was in no position to turn down the offer of a free meal, having not eaten since the previous afternoon. Plus, he had me genuinely interested when he mentioned possibly being able to restore my sight. Although I didn't allow myself to get my hopes up too much. I mean, for all I knew, he was some quack or con man. I decided to humor him and at the very least hear what he had to say. Sure. Why not? I said with a shrug. Excellent. He took me to a local chain restaurant. We sat down across from each other in a booth and he read the menu selections to me, giving my order to the server. He himself didn't order anything. The meal was easily the best I had had in weeks, which probably wasn't saying much since I had been sustained on a diet of fast food burgers and dumpster cast-offs for God only knew how long. I ate ravenously, gorging myself. He sat across from me mostly in silence, and I could feel his eyes studying me. After I had finished eating, he got down to business and laid it all out for me. He was a rather well-regarded neurosurgeon, now semi-retired, who had been an expert in the field of brain surgery for over 30 years. He had once worked for a major city hospital before stepping down and now worked teaching as a professor at a nearby medical school. He had recently made a major breakthrough in neurosurgery and devised a radical new procedure to repair damage to the optical lobe in the brain, the part of the brain that controlled vision. The part of my brain that had been turned into paste thanks to dear old Dad back when I was 8. He and his colleagues were looking for volunteer test subjects to try this new procedure out on, and I fit the bill. In addition to possibly being able to see again, I would be compensated for my contribution to medical science to the tune of $20,000. He warned me that the surgery was still highly experimental and not without risk. I could die or be rendered paralyzed or brain dead. When he was finished talking, he fell silent, awaiting my response. Frankly, I didn't feel like I had much to lose. My life was already shit. If it worked like he said it should, I would have my sight back and be 20 grand richer to boot. I would have a shot of finally being able to live a normal life. And if something went wrong and I wound up dead or a vegetable, well, then I wouldn't have to worry anymore about going hungry on a street corner without a roof over my head, at constant risk of starvation or dying from exposure, or even being murdered for thrills by some psycho who knew the cops wouldn't give fuck one about some blind homeless guy getting offed. This actually happened to a couple of guys I was casually acquainted with through my infrequent visits to the homeless shelter. I felt it was a win-win situation either way, so I didn't give it much thought before giving him my answer. Let's go for it. He seemed pleased with my response. We shook on it and he told me he would be in touch, and he knew where to find me when the time came. 3 weeks later, a taxi cab pulled up to me while I was on the sidewalk on another unsuccessful venture to generate some income through the mostly non-existent sympathy of the pedestrians who passed by. The driver told me he had been sent by Dr. Steiner to take me to the medical campus to prep me for surgery. He guided me into the back of the taxi, and off we went. 18 hours later, I was on an operating table surrounded by a team of physicians and technicians led by Dr. Steiner himself. He stood by my side and asked me if I was ready. I told him I was. He gave my shoulder a reassuring squeeze and told me I would be fine, although I thought I detected a faint note of uncertainty in his voice. I was hugely excited, knowing that when I woke up, I might be able to finally see the face of the man who was giving me this once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, and also terrified that I might not wake up at all. But there was no backing out now. The anesthesiologist placed the mask over my face and I breathed deeply, fading into the blackness without even knowing it, because the blackness had already been there all along. When I regained consciousness, my head, which was heavily bandaged, hurt like hell. My eyes were covered, but even through the layers of gauze, I could tell the surgery had been a success. I could detect light with my eyes, a barely perceptible sense of brightness. I sat up excitedly and immediately strong arms restrained me and forced me back down to the bed. I struggled. "Hey, let me go!" Dr. Steiner spoke my name in front of me and told me, "You must remain calm and relax. You need time to recover from the surgery." No, take the bandages off. I want to see." You'll have to wait at least another 3 days before the bandages can be removed, I'm afraid. To do so before could be detrimental to— But you don't understand! I shouted. It worked. I can see the light through the bandages. I do understand, and I'm glad to hear that, but you must remember you've been blind for the past 20 years. Your eyes will be extremely sensitive to light, and it could be very painful. You'll need to keep them covered until they've had time to adjust to what light they can already perceive. Fuck you, man! I screamed. If you don't calm down, I'm afraid I'll have to have your arms put in restraints and administer a sedative, he told me in a stern, authoritative voice. I sighed and finally relented. The arms holding me down, which I assumed belonged to a pair of orderlies, released me. Dr. Steiner spoke to me in a gentler tone. I can understand your excitement, and I know you're eager to see again, but this is necessary. All good things take time. If you say so, I muttered. I heard Dr. Steiner leave, but the two orderlies stayed with me in what I presumed was some kind of post-op recovery room to make sure I didn't try unwrapping my eyes myself. I lay there feeling miserable. I could finally see again after all these years, but I was still blind beneath the bandages wrapped around my head. I felt bitter at the irony of it. The next 3 days were going to be an eternity. If I had known what was to come, I would have kept my eyes bandaged. I would have preferred being blind. The next 3 days each seemed to last a lifetime. I became anxious, impatient, like a kid on Christmas Eve night, knowing that Santa is on his way with a big sack of toys. Or I assumed a kid would feel. We never celebrated Christmas when I was a kid. Being so poor, we could barely pay our bills, let alone buy presents. Gradually, the pain in my head subsided to a dull ache. Each minute seemed to drag by for an hour because I had no way of telling time. Finally, the big day arrived. Dr. Steiner entered the room. "Are you ready?" he asked me. "Does the Pope wear a dress?" I said by way of answer, trying to be clever. Of course I was ready. I had been ready to see again since that long ago day when I had woken up in a different hospital to discover the world had been swallowed by blackness. "Very well then. Please hold still while I remove the dressing." I did, feeling the pressure of his hand holding my head steady and the snicking of scissors as they cut through the gauze bound to the upper half of my head. My heart was pounding with anticipation, and I couldn't breathe. The bandages were unwrapped layer by layer, the world becoming a little brighter with each barrier that was removed. Just before the last layer of gauze was removed, I closed my eyes. "All right, open your eyes." For a moment, I didn't even dare to do it. I had been awaiting this moment for days, so excited I could barely sleep, and now that it was here, I was scared shitless. "Open your eyes," Dr. Steiner repeated patiently. I did. The world flooded my vision, banishing the darkness I had existed in for most of my life. I gasped. I could see. For a moment, I was so shocked, I couldn't even react. Everything was so clear, so vivid. It was as if I had just been born and was seeing the world for the first time through the eyes of an infant. The hospital room was overwhelmingly white and bright. Dr. Steiner stood before me, a distinguished-looking man in his mid-60s, older than I had originally thought, with rather shaggy salt and pepper hair and a full, well-manicured beard. He had a kind face and intelligent, thoughtful eyes. I looked at him as if I were seeing the face of God. "Well?" he asked me expectantly. I can see," I told him in a hushed tone of awe. He smiled, beaming with satisfaction and pride. "Congratulations." I want to go outside. I want to see the world." "Very well, but you'll have to go in a wheelchair," he said, and summoned a nurse to bring one and help move me into it. I was still kind of weak from the surgery. He wheeled me out of the room and down the corridor. I took in everything we passed on the way, amazed at even the simplest detail. The polished tile floor, the lime green walls, the fluorescent light fixtures burning overhead. Everything seemed to gleam, seemed to have an almost three-dimensional sheen to it. He took me through a set of double doors and into the lobby of the main hospital. We approached the main entrance and I could see sunlight flooding in through the windows. Sunlight. The first sunlight I had seen after 20 long years of endless night. He pushed a button to open the handicap-accessible automatic door and wheeled me outside. I sat there, looking around, my heart soaring with childish wonder and joy. A placid medical school campus lay before me, white, modern buildings dotting a rich green landscape. The sky overhead was a bright pale blue spotted with clouds. Everything seemed much bigger than it actually was. Everything seemed huge. Everything was clearly defined. The straight lines and angles of the buildings, the leaves of the maple trees, the texture of the bark. Medical students and staff walked here and there. My brain absorbed the colors of the clothes they were wearing, colors I had almost forgotten even existed. For a moment, I felt as if my brain was going to freeze up with sensory overload. It was all so overwhelming. Also incredibly beautiful. I realized I was weeping. Dr. Steiner placed his hand on my shoulder. "Welcome back," he told me. "Thank you," I whispered. I was kept at the medical school hospital for another month to recover from my brain surgery, and so Dr. Steiner and his colleagues could run a battery of tests to see how well I adjusted to being able to see again. They prepped me for life on the outside, explaining to me how the world had changed in the time I had been blind, told me what I was to expect once I left the hospital. They explained to me how I would have to find a residence of my own and then find a job, teaching me the ins and outs of making my way in the world. How I would have to open up a bank account, get a social security card, pay bills and rent, file taxes. They helped me catch up on my education some too, since I was still basically at the same second grade reading and writing level I had been at before I went blind. Despite what my grandparents, who hadn't been too well educated themselves, had tried to teach me after I went to live with them. They told me there were classes I could take after I was discharged to help improve my literacy skills, and gave me several numbers and websites I could visit. For me, probably the most incredible experience was finally seeing my own face in a mirror for the first time. I was stunned. The scrawny little 8-year-old I dimly remembered was long gone. The face of a 28-year-old man looked back at me. My sandy brown hair, which had been shaved and back from the surgery. A beard covered my lower face. I was deeply tanned from being outside for so long and gaunt from malnutrition. I sat there for several minutes in mute shock, peering into my own pale blue eyes reflected back at me in the mirror Dr. Steiner held for me. I looked at Dr. Steiner. "Can I get a shave and a haircut?" "I think that can be arranged," he replied. Afterwards, I took my first real shower, not including the one I had been given before surgery, in ages, reveling blissfully in the feeling of the warm spray of water. I felt like I was in heaven. Occasionally, I had pounding headaches and bolts of sharp pain would pierce my eyes. Dr. Steiner explained that this was perfectly normal and that it was my eyes still adjusting to being able to see again. He gave me painkillers for these episodes when they became too unbearable. I felt it was a small price to pay for the gift I had been given, the gift so many of us take for granted. I watched a lot of TV and movies on the TV in my room, and was given a laptop so I could search the internet, which had just been starting to take off when I went blind, catching up with all the current pop culture trends and celebrities who had risen, and subsequently fallen in some cases, since I had been 8. I also caught up on all the current technological advances I had missed out on, such as YouTube, smartphones, and Facebook. Everything seemed to be happening too fast. It seemed unreal. I wondered if all of this might just be a dream and any second I would wake up cold and hungry, lost once again in the blackness of my own private hell. It all seemed too good to be true. And I would soon find out it was. One afternoon, not long before I was discharged, I was out on the campus just sitting on a bench, enjoying the spring sunshine, still enthralled with my newly returned vision. A pretty blonde female med student in her early 20s was jogging down a path in front of me. Something else I had recently discovered was women. I had long since hit puberty, but being blind, I hadn't truly been able to appreciate the female form and all its wonders until just lately. I was incredibly horny all the time, especially after being exposed, in more ways than one, to the likes of Salma Hayek, Halle Berry, and Angelina Jolie in some of the movies I had seen on TV. Sex education was something else I needed to be caught up on. I took a moment to enjoy the sight of her lithe, athletic young figure clad in spandex shorts and a tank top in motion before me. I started to get an erection and quickly covered it with my hand, trying to do so casually. She spotted me and shot me a quick, friendly smile. For a split second, her face seemed to change. A ripple of distortion seemed to pass over her attractive features, the way that flat surface of a pond would ripple if you drop a pebble into it. I thought I glimpsed something else, something beneath her face. I couldn't tell what it was. She was moving, so it was a blur, but it looked like a patch of blackness with two bright spots of red in it. Just as quickly as it had happened, her face returned to normal and she passed me, her back to me as she continued jogging down the path. I was shocked, puzzled, and pretty damn frightened by what had just happened. I told Dr. Steiner about it when I went back inside, but he just reassured me that it was quite common for people who were recovering from brain surgery to experience visual and auditory hallucinations early on, especially when the part of the brain in question was the part that controlled sight. It could also be a side effect of the pain medication I had been taking. He told me it was nothing to worry about and that it should pass in time. I trusted his judgment, him being the professional, and let it go. And for a while, I believed he was right. I didn't experience anything else like that during the rest of my stay at the campus hospital. The horror started 6 months later.
Barnabas here with a brief reminder. If you're enjoying this series, don't forget to show your support for this fantastic author. You can find more of their work on Reddit under the username CarlB1961. They've got a plethora of great series for you to dive into, all of which can be found in the description and pinned comment of this video. Make sure you check them out on Patreon too, at CarlB1961 to show your support. Pardon my interruption, and let's get back to this incredible series.
I left the hospital a few days later with some new clothes and a few essentials Dr. Steiner had bought to help me get started with my new life. He shook my hand and wished me the best of luck, and I thanked him again for everything he had done for me. It was a hell of a lot more than most people had ever done for me my whole life. I had some basic toiletries, toothbrush, razor, shampoo, etc., along with my new clothes and an inexpensive duffel bag. I also had a check written in the amount of $20,000, which I soon deposited in the checking account I had opened at a local bank that same day, in my pocket. Next, I went about looking for a place to call home. A real home. All of my very own. I found a relatively cheap apartment in the city and made my first rent payment, plus a security deposit. It wasn't much, just one medium-sized room with a bed, table, kitchenette, and a small bathroom. But after my years of being homeless, it was like a penthouse apartment. A place where I could be warm and feel safe, and wouldn't have to worry about freezing to death in the middle of January. The next 5 months were without a doubt the happiest of my life. Maybe even the only truly happy time in my whole miserable life. I quickly found a job bagging groceries at a supermarket. It was the best I could do with my limited education and lack of skills, but it was better than nothing. And even made something I had never had before. a few friends. They also worked at the supermarket. Sometimes we'd get together after work at a bar to toss back a few and shoot the shit. I even started to flirt with a cute cashier named Nikki, who was almost a decade younger than me. Given time, we might have even become a couple. But things didn't work out that way. I was taking online classes at night to build upon my education, hoping I could eventually go for my GED. I even took a road test and got my driver's license, something I had never expected to be able to do, and used some of the money I had been given to purchase a halfway decent used car. I was still marveling at the miraculous return of my long-lost sight, and anytime I was downtown, I was amazed at how huge the city was, how tall the buildings were, how many people and vehicles there were, how fast things moved in the sighted world where you didn't have to grope around, feeling your way through the darkness, scared of what obstacles might be waiting in front of you, careful not to trip over anything in your path. People walked briskly and confident, secure in their visual ability, unaware of how easily it could be snatched away from them. Most of all, I was amazed at how colorful and bright the world was. Sometimes I would just stand in amazement, watching the sun glint off the glass of the towering skyscrapers, while people passing by gave me strange looks. Sometimes I'd sit in the park and watch the sunset, which had never seemed as glorious to me as a kid as it did then, after I had learned to truly appreciate being able to see it. For a while, I thought I actually had a real chance of leading a normal life, of being able to fit in and be accepted by society at last, for the first time in my life. Then, about 5 months after my surgery, the headaches returned. Minor at first. They gradually increased over the next few weeks into excruciating, pounding migraines that left me nearly paralyzed in bed, unable to do anything. They were much worse than the ones I had experienced while recovering from surgery in the hospital. My eyes hurt too, throbbing in their sockets, my vision occasionally becoming blurry and even doubled, like everything I saw was a double exposure of a photograph. Sometimes I saw flashes of bright light that seemed to fill my entire head, blotting out everything else. I missed several days of work and was threatened with the loss of my job, pathetic as it was. I was terrified, wondering if I was experiencing some kind of setback, if maybe my brain was starting to reject the surgery or something, and I was about to go blind again. I even wondered if I might be developing a brain tumor. I went to a doctor about my problem, who referred me to an ophthalmologist who could find nothing wrong with my eyes. I even went back to Dr. Steiner and told him what was going on. He had me returned to the hospital where they ran a CAT scan of my brain, but once again, there was nothing apparently wrong with me. He told me it was probably just a belated effect of the procedure I had undergone, and told me that some patients experience infrequent headaches for years after brain surgery. He prescribed some painkillers for me, which took the edge off of the agony, but never fully erased it. I was, just barely, able to function again and return to my job at the supermarket. Then, about a month after the headaches had begun, they abruptly ceased. I was relieved, thinking things had gone back to normal. They hadn't. I would soon find out things had changed for the worst. One early evening in mid-October, I was driving home from my shift and was stopped by a red light at a crosswalk. I sat there idling, not thinking about anything in particular, while a stocky, middle-aged businessman in a designer suit, clutching an expensive briefcase in one hand and arguing loudly to someone on the smartphone he was holding in the other, crossed in front of me. I watched him without too much interest, wondering half seriously if he might be the same self-important asshole who had told me to drop dead last spring, just before Dr. Steiner had come into my life. Still ranting on his phone, he threw me a passing glance, and his face changed. I froze in my seat, my hands involuntarily clutching the steering wheel so tightly, my knuckles turned white. It was the same thing I had seen happen to the girl jogging, only this time, his face didn't return to normal after a second as hers had. It was as if once my brain had registered the change, it became permanent, like my brain wouldn't allow my eyes to unsee it. I saw what lay hidden beneath his normal face. It was like a patch of thick black shadow covering where his face should have been. Thick, featureless shadow, in which two bright points of red light glowed, like embers in the ashes of a fire. Two red, burning, inhuman eyes. Then he was on the other side of the street and gone. I just sat there after the light had turned green, my heart racing, my mind reeling. What the fuck had just happened? I forced myself to stay calm while I drove home. Then, as soon as I entered my apartment, I collapsed on my bed having a panic attack. What I had just seen couldn't have been real. It had to be another hallucination, like the girl I had seen jogging at the campus. I remembered what Dr. Steiner had told me about brain surgery patients experiencing hallucinations while they recovered. But as far as I knew, I had recovered, and hadn't experienced anything else like that until tonight. I thought at first that maybe it was the pain medication I had been taking screwing with my head, causing me to see things. But I had stopped taking the pain meds when my headaches had ceased. I wondered if I was losing my mind, if maybe I should see a psychiatrist. I drank a couple of beers and slowly calmed myself down, trying to rationalize what I had seen. I'd been dealing with a lot of stress at work lately, picking up a ton of extra shifts since 2 other baggers had been out with the flu, and I told myself my tired, overworked mind had just imagined seeing the businessman's face change into whatever that thing had been. I convinced myself that's all it had been. My eyes playing tricks on me. A week went by without incident. Then one late afternoon, not long before Halloween, I was bagging groceries as usual, thinking about going with a couple of guys to see a movie after work and not really paying attention, when the customer I was bagging for, an older, upper-crust, high society woman in a fashionable Donna Karan dress and fur coat, began berating me for almost crushing her eggs beneath a bag of organic canned vegetables. I nodded apologetically, not really fazed as she continued to upbraid me harshly, a steady stream of insults and name-calling. Baggers were at the low end of the totem pole in the supermarket hierarchy and bore the brunt of the wrath when it came to rude customers. So I was used to it. Plus, I already had a thick skin from all the years of verbal and sometimes physical abuse I had endured from people while being homeless. I glanced up to offer her a brief, subservient smile and felt it freeze on my face. Where a moment before there had been the face, which bore the unnaturally tight, stretched look of someone who had had too many facelifts in a desperate bid to hold on to their fading good looks, of an elegant, upper-class woman wearing an expression of imperious, classist disdain, there was now only a smudge of inky blackness, solid except for 2 red, inhuman eyes that burned like coals. For a second I froze, feeling horror race through my heart. It was the first time I saw one up close. Only 4 feet separated us. I stared into that dark void where a face should have been, not hearing the woman, or the thing that looked like a woman, as it continued her harangue over the incompetence of the employees of this establishment. Those red eyes seemed to bore into my soul. I glanced quickly to the cashier, a surly, bitchy blonde teenager named Kim, but she was casually scanning the woman's coupons with a bored expression, unaware of the inhuman entity that stood on the other side of the register. The thing finally fell silent from its rant and seemed to regard me for a moment in silence, cocking its head slightly as if realizing that I could see through its disguise, could see its real face. Quickly, I snapped out of it, regaining my composure, and continued bagging its groceries, trying to appear as nonchalant as humanly possible. I glanced out of the corner of my eye to Kim as she finished checking out the woman's purchases and handed her the receipt. For a second, they made eye contact, but Kim didn't react to the horror directly in front of her. I realized that she couldn't see its true form. All she saw was a normal, if rather cuntish woman of higher social standing who looked down on the lower classes with contempt. "Have a nice day," I told the thing with forced cheeriness as it wheeled its shopping cart out of the store, ignoring me. The moment it was out of the store, I felt myself collapsing inwardly. I felt like my head was spinning. I was quivering a little, and abruptly I realized I was going to be sick. I told Kim I had to use the restroom and I would be right back. She just rolled her eyes, uninterested. I made a beeline for the nearest men's room, burst in to find it, fortunately, empty, and ducked into a stall, vomiting into the toilet. When I finished, I just knelt there for a while, gasping for air, trying to pull myself back together. Something was going on here, something I didn't understand. Something frightening. When I had myself more or less under control, I cleaned up at the sink, splashing water on my face, then patting it dry with paper towels, and then I exited the men's room. "Are you all right?" An older cashier named Casey, who I was kind of friendly with, asked me as I returned to the front end of the supermarket. "You look kind of pale." I smiled at her calmly and told her I did feel a little sick. I must have caught what Zach and Randall had had last week. She looked concerned and told me I should go home and get some rest. I told her I would do just that. Luckily for me, my shift was almost over and I had the next 2 days off. I finished my shift, and as soon as I'd clocked out, I left the store and headed across the mostly deserted parking lot towards my car. It was early evening and already mostly dark, except for what light was cast by the parking lot light poles. I kept glancing around, leery, paranoid, half convinced that thing was going to pop out from some hiding place and attack me before I reached the car. I walked slowly, my ears turned for the slightest sound. I felt my heart sink when I heard footsteps approaching steadily in my direction. I hurried to my car, frantically fumbling my keys out of my pocket, and dropped them. I reached for them, and a voice spoke my name directly behind me. I jumped and spun around, exhaling with relief when I saw that it was just 2 other baggers I had gotten close with, Carrie and Neil, both of whom were around my age. They asked me if I was ready to go to the movie we had been planning on seeing, but I told them I wasn't feeling very well and told them to go on without me, that we'd do another movie some other time. They both seemed to understand, said goodbye, and then walked off. I got in my car and made sure to lock my doors before taking off. My thoughts were racing as I drove home, and I wasn't paying full attention, almost rear-ending a Honda Civic stopped in front of me at a red light, causing the driver to stick his hand out the window and flip me off. I parked outside my apartment complex and made my way to the building, still glancing around nervously. I didn't feel safe until I was in my apartment with the door shut and locked behind me. I sat at the table in front of the second-hand TV I had bought. There was a horror movie on one of the channels. An Egyptian mummy was stalking the residents of an upscale Manhattan high-rise. I stared blankly at the screen, not seeing the movie. I was lost in deep thought, trying to make sense of it all. There were beings out there that looked and acted and even sounded human, things that apparently only I could see in their true form. I'd encountered 2 so far, or maybe 3, including the jogging girl at the medical school campus. I didn't know what they were, where they had come from, or, most importantly, what they were doing here. Part of me still wanted to rationalize what was going on. maybe they were hallucinations, or maybe I was really going crazy. But the rest of me didn't buy it. If everyone I encountered looked like one of those things, maybe I could have believed I was nuts, but so far, it had only happened to a select few. I thought about calling someone, the police, my doctors, but what could they do? No one else could see what those things really looked like. The doctors would think I was seeing things, and the cops would think I was a lunatic or some asshole pulling a half-assed prank. They'd probably figure I was drunk or on drugs. I realized with cold dismay, I was on my own. I didn't know what was going on, but I was determined to find out. I decided that the next time I saw one of those creatures, I was going to follow it and get to the bottom of this. This proved to be a terrible mistake. I was off the next 2 days. I didn't let them go to waste by staying in my apartment or hanging out with my friends. Instead, I began to search. I wandered the city up and down the sidewalks, through parks and parking lots, pretending to browse in shops and department stores. I took the subway from one end of the town to the other and then back again. I was watching people. Everyone I saw, I studied them carefully, trying to be discreet. I watched the crowds of pedestrians on the sidewalks, the commuters who rode the subway, the young trophy wives and career women who went shopping at the more upscale department stores, the bohemian artists and lovers seated at the outdoor cafes, the people enjoying their day in the park. Indian summer had arrived and it was unreasonably warm. The people dining in the fast food restaurants where I went to eat my meals. I watched everyone I saw, carefully studying their faces for the slightest flicker, the slightest discrepancy. I tried to appear casual, indifferent. I imagined that, to most people, I had the look of your usual fish-out-of-water small-town tourist newly arrived in town and just seeing the city for the first time. I spent that entire first day doing that, and when it got dark, I returned to my apartment having learned nothing. I wondered again if I might just be imagining all of this, and I fell into a troubled sleep. The next day, I repeated the process. It was a gorgeous, bright fall day, the trees in the park lush with the dazzling colors of autumn foliage, red, orange, yellow. But I took no notice. The novelty of being able to see again had worn off, and I was on a mission. I began to lose hope as the day drifted towards early evening and the sun began to set. I hadn't encountered anything out of the ordinary. Not one person whose face had given even the subtlest indication that they weren't what they appeared to be. I was just about to give up and return home when it happened. A man was walking down the sidewalk on the other side of the street, going in the opposite direction. He was a young guy, probably mid-20s, and had the rakish good looks and fashion of your typical rich playboy, leading a carefree lifestyle of casual debauchery. A casual Armani suit, shirt unbuttoned at the throat to display a gold chain, matching Rolex on one wrist. The kind of pampered, entitled scumbag who lived in a penthouse and survived off Daddy's trust fund, and always had cocaine residue around his nostrils and spent his nights in clubs picking up women he would never see again after the next morning. I gave him a cursory glance, and his face rippled. My heart skipped a beat. His face wavered, distorting before transforming into that black, formless void I knew so well. His soulless red eyes glowed in the near darkness. He continued on his way down the sidewalk. I stood there for a moment, feeling a brief flicker of indecision. Then I crossed the street and began to follow after him. He walked unhurriedly, but purposefully, seemingly with some destination in mind. I tracked him from a cautious distance behind, careful to avoid detection. I followed him for over an hour as the sun finished setting and nightfall descended. The streetlights came on automatically. The crowds of pedestrians gradually dried up, and the streets became less populated. I followed him, or rather, it, to the very outskirts of the city, into the industrial district, warehouses and factories surrounding us, smokestacks towering to the night sky, colossal black shapes against a backdrop of navy blue sky dotted with stars. The streets became increasingly deserted until it was just the two of us, and an occasional wino huddled around a fire drum, none of whom paid us any mind. The area became more rundown and dilapidated the further we walked. The street littered with trash, burned out cars on the curbs, brick walls covered with spray-painted gang graffiti. Some of the buildings were long abandoned, their windows boarded up, except for those that had been broken into by squatters and junkies, looking for a place to shoot up. A lot of the streetlights had been smashed out and it was much darker here. I became scared, not just because of the strange entity I was pursuing. This was a bad part of town to be in during the day, and here I was, smack dab in the middle of it at night. I scanned my surroundings cautiously, eyeing any potential hiding places in the thick shadows where I half expected to be ambushed any second by a mugger or a drug addict or a gang. At last, my quarry stopped, about 50 yards ahead of me, and turned down an alleyway between a meatpacking plant and a half-burned-down warehouse, disappearing from view. I stopped there, debating with myself if I should continue after him. It could be a trap. Maybe he had caught on that somebody was following him. Part of me wanted to turn around and go home, to just forget about the whole thing. Part of me didn't want to know the answer to this mystery, to just leave it alone and resume living my average, everyday life. But I had already come too far. I had to know. I went to the mouth of the alley, walking as quietly as possible, and peered in. At first, I was confused by what I was seeing. 30 feet away, the young man thing was standing with its back to me, holding a young girl in a tight lover's embrace. They at first appeared to be kissing, but then I noticed that their mouths were not actually touching. The thing had its mouth, or rather, the empty black space where its mouth should have been, about 3 inches away from the girl's parted lips. It appeared to be hyperventilating, sharp, rapid intakes of breath. But he didn't seem to be exhaling, only inhaling. I can't explain it any better than that. It looked like he was performing mouth-to-mouth resuscitation in reverse, and instead of blowing air into the girl's lungs, he was sucking air out. Then I saw the expression on the girl's face, a frozen look of pure, helpless terror. She seemed to be paralyzed in the arms of the thing that held her. As I watched, she went slack, going limp in its arms as if she had passed out. It let her go and she dropped to the pavement like a sack of potatoes. I was so dumbstruck with confusion and shock, I just stood there transfixed, instead of ducking out of sight. The thing in the casual Armani suit turned to leave, and stopped in its tracks, its burning red gaze locked upon me. For a long, seemingly endless moment, neither of us reacted. We just stared at each other. Fleetingly, I felt an absurd, insane sense of awkward embarrassment, the way you might feel when you walk in on someone doing something private that you shouldn't be seeing. Then the thing spoke to me, and its voice was completely ordinary and human. The slightly anxious voice of a man in his 20s with a trace of panic that I knew was totally bogus. Hey man, you better call 911 quick. I think this chick's having a heart attack or something. I was bewildered by this for a second. And then it dawned on me that the creature wasn't yet aware that I could see past its facade and knew it wasn't human. I stared at it, wide-eyed, and asked in a low, nearly strengthless voice, "What are you?" Its body noticeably tensed, and I think it understood at that moment that I could see through its deception. "What the fuck are you?" I asked it again. It didn't answer me. Instead, it let out an unearthly, high-pitched howl and suddenly charged at me, moving with shocking speed, hurling towards me like a bullet. Part of my brain told me to run and flee, but I didn't listen. I acted purely on instinct, not pausing to analyze my actions. I grabbed a 4-foot length of rusty iron pipe from a heap of junk beside me, and as the thing closed in, I swung at its head. The pipe connected solidly with its head with a thwack sound, and the shadow-faced thing tumbled to the ground at my feet. In a burst of frantic, terrified adrenaline, I swung the pipe into its head over and over in a wild frenzy. I felt blood spatter on my face. When I finally stopped, sometime later, I let the pipe fall from my hands and clang to the ground. It lay there, motionless, covered in blood, and I knew it was dead. I stood there, gasping over its body, and then stepped over it and approached the girl to see if I could help her. She lay there, already pale, her eyes staring dully up at the night sky, not breathing. I could tell, without having to check, that she was dead. She looked very young, maybe 16 at the most, and was pretty with bleached blonde hair, but at the same time had a certain harshness, a worn quality to her face, as if she had been prematurely aging from a tough life on the streets. She was wearing high heels, a short leather miniskirt, and a fishnet top with no bra underneath. And I had a good idea what her profession had been. I went back to the mouth of the alley, stepping over the corpse of the thing that had killed her to leave. And as I glanced down at it, I felt a fresh sense of horror rising within me. The thing's face had reverted back to that of the young man I had originally seen. A perfectly normal, human face, albeit covered in blood. Glazed eyes opened in shock, mouth agape, as if he had been trying to scream or call for help when he had died. His skull had been split open from the force of the bludgeoning I had given him, and blood and a pink, pulpy substance I knew had to be brain matter was slowly leaking out of his head and forming a puddle on the pavement. Gagging, trying not to throw up, I fled the alley and ran off into the night. I ran home, hardly stopping on the way even to catch my breath. I didn't encounter anyone on the streets, which was probably good because a horrified man, spattered with blood running down a city street at night, was a sure sight to arouse suspicion. The police would have been notified. But in my current state, I didn't stop to consider all of that. When I got to my apartment, I slammed the door behind me, gasping for air, my lungs aching, and slid down it to the floor, sitting there in shock for what felt like hours. I couldn't believe what I had just done. I had just murdered someone, something I had never envisioned myself being capable of doing. I felt numb, surreal, like I was in a dream, a nightmare I hoped to awaken from at any second. I didn't. After a while, I forced myself up and stumbled into the bathroom, looking at myself in the mirror. My face and clothes were covered with streaks of blood that had already started to dry. My pale, blue eyes looked back at me, wide and vacant with shock. I wet a washcloth and wiped myself clean and then left the bathroom. I stood there looking around blankly, uncertain about what I should do next. The gravity of the situation struck me all at once, like a bullet, and I collapsed on my bed, weeping hysterically, suddenly overwhelmed with remorse and self-loathing. Anytime I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Dead eyes, wide in horror, mouth open, his expression almost pleading. His head, smashed open and misshapen by the pipe I had used to kill him. I really had gone insane, I realized. It had been a hallucination all along. The girl in the alley really must have experienced a heart attack or something, and the guy had been trying to help her, and it looked to me, the only person around to call for help. Instead, I experienced a psychotic episode, had imagined him attacking me and acted out on my own paranoid delusions, bashing his brains out in that dark alleyway. My new life, which I had just been starting to enjoy, was over. I thought about turning myself into the police, even briefly considered suicide out of guilt, when something else dawned on me that floored me with a fresh wave of panic. In my shock, I had left the murder weapon, the pipe I had used, right there in the alleyway for the police to find when they discovered the bodies. The pipe that would have my fingerprints on it. I didn't have to turn myself in. Eventually, the police would come to me themselves, would arrest me. They'd charge me with the murder of the young man, and probably the girl as well. I'd spend the rest of my lousy life in prison, or some psychiatric hospital at best, if I told them what had really happened. What I had thought had happened, anyway. I never felt as low as I did that night, even during the bleakest times I had spent blind and homeless. I wished I was dead, that I had never had that surgery and regained my sight. I would have preferred dying on the streets of starvation compared to this hell I found myself living in now. I got drunk and passed out. I awoke the next morning severely hungover. The events of the night before seemed unreal. I tried to tell myself it had just been a bad dream, that nothing had really happened. But then, when I sat down to drink some coffee and turned on the TV, this brief, pleasant moment of denial came crashing down. The news was on. A picture of the man I had murdered was on the screen. The newscaster explained that the body of the 26-year-old playboy son of a prominent lawyer had been found on the other side of the city, beaten to death in an alley in an apparent mugging gone wrong. The body of a 17-year-old known prostitute and drug addict had been found nearby as well, but she appeared to have died of natural causes, and police didn't believe the two deaths were connected. Police theorized that the man's murder might have actually been a revenge killing, and noted that he had a rather unsavory reputation for his swinging bachelor lifestyle, and was rumored to have several debts to big-time drug dealers. Police were investigating the murder. My cup of coffee dropped from my hand, splashing upon the table. With numb fingers, I turned off the TV. It was all over. Everything was over. I tried to decide what to do next. I knew it was only a matter of time before the police identified me by the fingerprints I had left on the pipe and came for me. I had to leave. Just pack up my things and leave the city. Abandon my life, my job and new friends, and go somewhere else far away. I called in sick at the supermarket, explaining to my manager that I had caught the flu bug going around. He wasn't particularly sympathetic, still annoyed over the several days of work I had already missed due to the headaches I had experienced during the last month. Then I packed my duffel bag and headed for my door. I stopped when I spotted what was on the floor below it. A folded sheet of white paper someone had slipped beneath it the night before. I sat down my bag, picked up the sheet of paper, and unfolded it. A message had been written in block letters and black marker. I read it in disbelief, and then read it again. I saw what you did. You're not crazy. I can see them too. Meet me tonight at 9 in the park, west side. Below that, in smaller writing, P.S. Don't worry about the pipe. I got rid of it for you. I left my apartment at 8:30 that evening and made my way to the park, which was only about 6 blocks away. It was a chilly fall night. Indian summer had disappeared overnight, and I was glad I had decided to wear a jacket. I was extremely nervous. No, more than that. I was scared shitless, but also intrigued. I felt a great deal of apprehension about going to this clandestine nighttime meeting with the mystery person who had left me that message. I wondered if it could be a setup. Maybe the rest of those things I had seen had identified me somehow and were planning to kill me to avenge their slain comrade. Or maybe it was a police ambush. Except whoever had written the note knew that I was seeing things, knowledge the police had no way of coming by. Either way, I had to go. I couldn't pass this opportunity up. I had some burning questions I wanted answers, and if there was anyone who knew what the hell was going on, what I had gotten myself involved in, it was this person, whoever they were. I entered the main park gate and strolled down one of the paths. The park was deserted this time of night. It was dead silent except for the distant sounds of an occasional car passing by on the streets and the infrequent wail of a police siren. It was a moonless night, and the park was pitch black except for the light from the lamppost that dotted the path every 100 feet or so. I walked, heading for the west side, feeling uneasy, scanning the darkness around me for any sign of movement, or a pair of red, glowing eyes. Up ahead, I spotted someone sitting on a bench. Coincidentally, the same one where I myself had sometimes sat to enjoy the sunset, near one of the lampposts, its yellow halo of light casting a shadow upon him or her, so that all I could see was an indistinct silhouette. They were motionless, just sitting there, seemingly waiting for someone. I stopped and just stood there for a few moments, appraising the figure. Whoever they were, their eyes weren't glowing red, which I took to be a good sign. I swallowed, summoning my courage, and approached. As I drew nearer, I saw it was a young guy wearing a dark windbreaker and jeans. He looked to be around 22 or so, and was pale with short black hair and glasses. He was thin and gangly and looked like every awkward social outcast in every high school movie you ever saw. The kind of guy who had probably been on first-name terms with all the jock assholes who had shoved his face into a toilet on a regular basis after 10 of them had used it and hadn't flushed. I stopped again about 10 paces away, watching his face for a few seconds. It didn't ripple or distort. He looked back at me casually, almost blandly, his face expressionless. Except for his eyes, which bore the hollow, haunted look of a shell-shocked veteran. I went up to him and spoke, getting straight to business, not wasting time on small talk. "All right, who the fuck are you and what do you know?" He gestured for me to sit next to him. I did. "My name's Jeremy," he told me. "I didn't ask for your fucking name. Just tell me what's going on," I said testily. I admit, I was pretty on edge, wound tight. "Look," he snapped at me. "Do you want to hear what I have to say or not? If you do, shut the fuck up and listen." I was a little taken aback by his sudden aggressiveness, so I shut the fuck up and listened. He studied my face for a moment. "You had a brain injury, didn't you? The optical lobe, right?" I was shocked. "How the fuck do you know that?" "Because the same thing happened to me." "How did you find me?" I asked him. "I was following you last night. The whole time you were following that thing." "You were?" I said, surprised. It had never occurred to me that while I had been stalking that shadow-faced creature from across the city, someone had also been stalking me. I had never had even the vaguest suspicion. "Yep, I stayed pretty far back so you wouldn't detect me. The same thing you were doing to it." He seemed amused by this. "Why were you following me?" "Actually, I started off following that thing, then you came along. I thought at first you were planning to rob him. It. I figured I should see what you were up to, just in case it might be worth my while." I guess it was. "How do you know where I lived?" "I followed you back, afterwards," he said, as if it should have been self-evident. "I was going to knock on your door after you got back, but I figured you might be pretty shook up by what happened and needed some time to calm down." "So you saw me kill it?" "Yes. I was actually planning on taking it out myself, but you beat me to it." I was startled. "You were gonna kill it?" "Yeah. It wouldn't have been the first time." I felt my skin crawl with his casual admittance. "How many?" I asked him. Jeremy shrugged. "I don't know, maybe 20? I kind of lost count after a while. That's the reason there are not as many of them in this city as there are in others." "Jesus Christ!" I said, appalled, looking at him with horror. I had thought I was crazy, but this dude was a full-fledged psychopath. I was sitting here in this deserted city park in the middle of the night, next to a serial killer. He reacted to my judgmental stare, becoming offended and defensive. "Hey, don't look at me like that. It has to be done. You seemed to think so yourself last night." "That was different," I protested. "I just wanted to see what it was up to. That thing attacked me. Self-defense. You're talking about cold-blooded murder." He laughed scornfully. "Bullshit. Those things aren't human. You saw it. You saw what it did to that girl." I stared at him. "What the hell are they?" Jeremy shook his head. "I don't know. I wish to God I did. Maybe they're demons or some kind of vampires. Honestly, I don't know much more than you do. I think they might have been human at some point, but then they got taken over or possessed or who the fuck knows." "What was that thing doing to that girl?" I asked him. "Couldn't you see for yourself?" "I saw it, but I don't know what I was seeing. It was draining her life force out," he explained. He paused. "Or maybe..." "Maybe what?" I demanded. Jeremy looked at me, troubled and frightened. "Or maybe it was sucking out her soul."
Barnabas here with a brief reminder. If you're enjoying this series, don't forget to show your support for this fantastic author. You can find more of their work on Reddit under the username CarlB1961. They've got a plethora of great series for you to dive into, all of which can be found in the description and pinned comment of this video. Make sure you check them out on Patreon too, at CarlB1961 to show your support. Pardon my interruption, and let's get back to this incredible series.
"Were you blind for a while too?" he asked me. I chuckled slightly. "A little bit more than a while. Try 20 years. He nodded. "That's about what I figured. Tell me how it happened, he told me. I gave him the Cliff Notes version of my life story, ending with how I had begun seeing the bizarre, malevolent, shadow-faced entities a little over a week ago. Your turn, I said after I had finished. Jeremy told me his own story. He had grown up in a much more stable, solidly middle-class family with parents who had actually taken care of him and given a shit what happened to him. Unlike me, the incident that had robbed him of his sight had been a total accident. When he had been 12, he had been goofing off and climbing the big oak tree in the front lawn. A branch had snapped and he'd fallen 30 feet, hitting the back of his head on a rock. He had been in a coma for a week with a fractured skull and a concussion. When he had awoken in the hospital, he had been blind. However, the damage to his brain hadn't been as severe as mine, and after a couple more weeks, after the swelling had gone down, his vision had returned, good as new, on its own. His family had taken him home from the hospital and tried to put it behind them. But things had never been the same for Jeremy after his accident. He had begun experiencing agonizing, debilitating headaches. They came and went infrequently, and then stopped altogether after about a month. But then, he had begun seeing things. He had witnessed his first shadow face, as he called them, a few days after his headaches had ceased. It had happened on the school playground during recess. A boy from a different 6th grade classroom, not a friend but someone he only knew casually, no longer had a face. Only an oval patch of blackness and 2 red, glowing eyes. It seemed that, unlike me, Jeremy's brain, or eyes, or both, didn't need a moment to catch up before seeing these things in their real form. He could spot them instantly. Understandably, Jeremy had been pretty freaked out. He had told the recess monitor, who had told his teacher, who had told the principal, who had then called his parents. His parents had taken him to a doctor, thinking he might be experiencing hallucinations as a result of his head injury. A number of tests had been run, but they'd found nothing wrong with him. His parents told him that he had probably just imagined the whole thing because of all the stress he had endured after his accident and the temporary blindness he had experienced. He had learned pretty quickly that he was the only one who could see what the boy's hidden face really looked like, and that unless he wanted people to think that he was a psycho, he had better keep his mouth shut about it. He had become obsessed with the shadow face at his school, and he had spied on him every chance he got. The shadow face had seemed to act no differently from any of the other kids, eating lunch with them and playing around with them during recess. At first, Jeremy had thought it might be harmless, despite the terrifying black emptiness where its face should have been and its red eyes. Then, a couple weeks later, a girl from Jeremy's class had disappeared on her way home from school. At first, the police had thought she'd been abducted, but that same day, her body was found in a pharmacy parking lot not far from school. There had been no signs of sexual assault or foul play, and the medical examiner had concluded that she had died from an asthma attack, of which the girl had had a history of. She had been found clutching an empty inhaler, and police figured she had experienced an attack on the way home and had tried to reach the pharmacy to get a refill, but had collapsed before she could make it. There were no witnesses, and this had happened 10 years earlier, before CCTV cameras outside most businesses were commonplace. Jeremy hadn't connected this to the shadow face at the time, but a month or so later, he had been walking home from school himself and had first discovered just how dangerous these creatures were. He had been walking down the sidewalk, passing the board fence of a junkyard on the way, and had heard something. A gasp, followed by a muffled cry of alarm that had been abruptly cut off. It had come from nearby, from the junkyard, to his left. He had gone to the fence and peered through a knothole in it. And what he had seen was something he could never forget. 10 feet away, the shadow face was clutching a boy, who also went to their school but was a grade behind them, with both hands holding him close, face to face. Jeremy could see the other boy's face was a contorted mask of terror, his eyes bulging. His body was tense, rigid. He appeared to be frozen in the creature's grasp. The thing had its mouth close to the boy's and looked like it was sucking the air out of him. Without thinking, Jeremy had thrown down his book bag and vaulted the fence to try to save the other boy. He had landed in the junkyard. Too late, just as the shadow face was dropping the corpse of the boy to the ground. Jeremy had frozen as it turned its burning red stare to him. He had backed up, trapped, cornered against the fence as the thing had approached him, chuckling. "You tasted good," it had told him. "And you're gonna taste even better." In desperation, Jeremy had fumbled in his back pocket for the Swiss Army knife his grandfather had given him on his last birthday. He pulled out the blade, and just as the shadow face stepped close and reached out to grab him, he had thrust the blade forward into its throat. It had staggered back, gurgling and gasping, reaching for the knife protruding from its throat. It had pulled the knife out, tossed it aside, and started to shuffle forward to Jeremy, blood squirting from the wound in its throat. It had taken 2 steps, then fallen forward to the ground, dead. After a moment, its face had reverted back to that of the normal 12-year-old boy Jeremy remembered from school, before his accident. Jeremy had paused only long enough to grab his knife, then scrambled back over the fence, retrieved his book bag, and run home, not saying a word to anyone about what had happened. The next morning, Jeremy had seen on the news that the bodies of the 2 boys had been discovered by the junkyard custodian. Police theorized that they had been trespassing together in the junkyard after school and had probably been murdered by a vagrant who had been squatting there. Jeremy had tried to put it all behind him and continued on with his life, trying to put the nightmare behind him, thinking it was over. It wasn't. Several months later, near the end of the school year, the principal had retired. The entire school had been assembled in the gymnasium to be introduced to her replacement, a man. He had greeted the students, favoring them with red eyes that burned from the depths of the blank, dark nothingness of his face. Jeremy had experienced a nervous breakdown, and his parents had sent him to a psychiatric hospital where he had been diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder. He had remained there for over a year, enduring therapy and more medications than he could even name, until he had finally faked a recovery convincing enough for his doctors to decide he was rehabilitated. He knew what he was seeing weren't delusions, though. Not after the medications had failed to erase the shadow faces, one of which had been one of the doctors at the facility. He had, just barely, been able to function in the outside world, managing to finish high school before moving to the city. "Wait a minute," I interrupted him at this point. "You mean you're not from around here?" "No, my folks live on the other side of the state," Jeremy answered. Something was bothering me, something he had said before. "What do you mean when you said there weren't as many of them in this city as in the others?" He gave me a look that was half contempt, half amusement. "Shit, you seriously think this thing was only happening here?" Fuck, man. This thing is happening everywhere. All over the world. It's huge. It goes all the way to the top. I looked at him, stunned and scared. What do you mean it goes all the way to the top? Just turn on the TV when you get home. You'll see what I mean, he replied, and then continued. In the time between his discharge from the psychiatric facility and the move, he had only encountered 1 or 2 other shadow faces. In person, anyway. The TV had been a whole different story. He had stopped watching TV pretty quickly, along with movies. He had moved to the city 4 years ago, and ever since he had been stealthily following any of those things he encountered, spying on them, and whenever he felt he could risk it, killing them. He killed each of them differently so as to throw the police off so they didn't notice a pattern and link the killings. Sometimes he robbed the bodies after he was finished, taking their money and valuables so that it seemed like there was more of a motive. A couple times, he had even successfully staged the killings so that they resembled a freak accident or suicide, such as pushing one shadow face into the path of an oncoming subway when he had been certain the platform had been deserted besides the 2 of them. He had learned a couple of interesting details in the time he had been observing these things. Most shadow faces, but not anywhere near all, tended to be from the upper echelons of society, the rich and powerful. Doctors, lawyers, politicians, industrialists, even movie and TV stars, and athletes. They blended in perfectly with society, doing the same things we did. Drink, party, work, screw. He had even seen one arguing with a human companion who had been completely oblivious to the monstrosity wearing a Brooks Brothers suit, sitting beside him for an after-work drink at a trendy bar about the upcoming presidential election. Also, after you killed them, their faces always changed back to that of a normal person's, adding credence to his theory that they had once been human. Most surprisingly, to me anyway, was the fact that most shadow faces also had families. Human families. Perfectly normal wives and husbands and children who were completely unaware of what they were sharing their lives in homes and, in the cases of the spouses, beds with. I shuddered at the thought, and another thought occurred to me, so I asked him, "Have you ever seen more than one of these shadow face things in a family?" "You mean like a couple living together?" "No, they seem to work solo." No, I mean the kids. Do you think it's possible they can..." I trailed off. He looked at me and saw what I was getting at. He shook his head, much to my relief. "No, all the kids I've seen looked totally normal. That doesn't exactly mean anything, though. I mean, maybe they don't mature until they hit puberty or something." Shadow faces drank and ate normal food like anyone else. But every once in a while, usually after a month or 2, they also fed on something else. Us. They'd slip out in the dead of night after the family was asleep and prey upon someone, usually from the lower elements of society, people who wouldn't be missed. Pimps, prostitutes, addicts, petty criminals, runaways, and the homeless. I shivered, not just from the chilly night air. I felt dead cold inside. Jeremy noticed. "What is it?" I used to be homeless," I admitted to him. He whistled. "You really beat the odds, dude, in more ways than one." I didn't respond. I recalled those 2 guys I had vaguely known from the shelter, the ones who had been murdered, supposedly for kicks. And now I wondered. Shadow faces usually left their victims where they fell. There was never a mark on them, and the authorities usually chalked their deaths off to exposure or an accidental overdose or some kind of medical condition. Occasionally, they'd mutilate their victims after death to further throw suspicion off themselves and their true motives. "And I'll tell you something else," Jeremy said, looking distinctly worried for the first time. "I think there are more than there used to be." "What do you mean?" I asked. "When I first moved here, usually I only saw 1 or 2 a month. Now if I'm lucky, I only see that many in a week, sometimes more. I think they're multiplying somehow." "What the fuck are they?" I asked him. "I don't know. I already told you that. I don't know where they came from either. I don't even know how long they've been here. Maybe they've always been here, living among us, preying upon us." He fell silent. "Go on," I told him. "Tell me the rest." He shrugged. "That's pretty much it, until I stumbled upon you last night." I sat there, absorbing everything he had just told me. I was floored. I hadn't suspected just how big this thing was, how far it reached. I tried to grasp the scope of it, the enormity of it, and the implications. I asked him, "How many of them do you think there are? I mean, total." "You mean in the world? Shit, I couldn't tell you." "Well, make a guess," I pressed him. "You know more about this than I do." Jeremy thought about it for a moment and then shrugged. "Thousands, at least. Maybe even a couple million. I think we still outnumber them by a comfortable margin, for now anyway." I was quiet for a while, mulling over it all. "We have to do something," I said finally. "Like what? Like tell someone? Who do you want to tell? The police? The military? The government? They think we were nuts. No one can see these things but us. Nobody can help us. We're on our own. We can't be alone. There must be others like us. People who have had brain injuries and..." He cut me off, speaking derisively. "Maybe there are, but even then we're talking a handful of people at the most, scattered around the world. What? You want to start a resistance group? How the fuck are you going to find them? You going to hold a conversation? Put out ads? Have you experienced a head injury and can now see the soul-sucking monsters lurking among us? Join us for our first annual meeting. Are you going to provide refreshments? I've been dealing with this shit for 10 years, and you're the only other person like me that I've ever met. Frankly, I was convinced I was all alone before last night. And the odds of the two of us meeting were probably 1 in a billion. It was just luck. We happened to be in the right place at the right time last night. You probably stand a better chance of winning the lottery 10 times in a row before you come across someone else like me." He fell silent. Neither of us spoke for a while. I was lost in thought. Jeremy was right. Assuming there were others like us who could see these things, we were too far and too far scattered to do each other any good, and had no way of finding each other. So what are we gonna do? We aren't going to do shit. You're going to have to figure out what you want to do about this on your own. I looked at him, confused. "What the fuck are you talking about? I mean, after tonight, you're not gonna see me ever again. I'm gonna stay out of your way and you're gonna stay the fuck out of mine. We're each gonna do our own thing by ourselves." "Wait a minute," I said, feeling alarmed. "You can't just abandon me like this. We just met. You're the only one who knows what's going on. Hey, I don't know shit. I already told you everything I know. What the fuck did you think? We were gonna team up together and fight the forces of darkness as a duo? You've been watching too much Supernatural. It's dangerous for us being together. How the fuck so? I demanded. Do you think those things are stupid? You think they're not aware that a few people are aware of their existence? No, they know. Someone's been picking them off one by one. They just don't know who. Every time I go after one, I'm putting my ass on the line. Each time, I don't know if I'm being led into a trap. We're a risk to each other if we stick together. I don't know anything about you, and you don't know anything about me. If we teamed up and they got one of us, they'd torture us to find out who the other one is. Then we'd both be dead, and who the fuck would be left to fight them? Not to mention if one of us got busted by the cops. Jeremy, I started. That's not my real name. I don't want you to know anything about me, and I don't want to know anything about you. I just wanted to meet you because I thought you had a right to know what the score was. I thought you deserved to know what was going on. And I'll give you a little advice. Just forget this whole goddamn thing. Ignore them and try to live a normal life. Pretend it's not happening and you might be more happy. A haunted look came over his face. Frankly, I wish that's what I'd done right at the start. I mean, what good can two guys do fighting these things on their own? There's no way we'll ever be able to stop them. I'm leaving now. Don't follow me, and if you see me in the city, don't try to talk to me or approach me. I'll run. Stay the fuck away from me. He stood up from the bench and turned to leave. He threw me a final glance. Think about what I said. We weren't meant to know about this. There's a reason most people can't see them. We're freaks, you and I. For all we know, those things might be part of the natural order. Good luck. He took off, jogging down the path, disappearing into the darkness. I never saw him again. It was nearly midnight before I returned to my apartment. I sat at the table, thinking about everything Jeremy had told me. I looked at my TV. I hadn't watched much TV since the headaches had gone away. I'd been too busy lately dealing with work and this nightmare I had gotten myself mixed up in. I remembered what he had said about watching the TV when I got back. I turned it on and watched. I changed the channels rapidly, and I couldn't believe what I saw. There were so many of them, on the news and on talk shows and game shows and infomercials and commercials and TV series and movies. Shadow faces with glowing red eyes. And a lot of them were pretty famous. Movie stars and politicians and pro athletes and musicians. I won't name names, but you'd be shocked. Some of them had starred in the movies I had seen at the hospital after I had recovered from my surgery. Some of them were the film sex goddesses I had found myself lusting after. Now that I could see their true appearance, I felt repulsed. An alarming possibility occurred to me. I switched back to the news. They were covering the upcoming presidential election. The president was speaking at a campaign rally. To my immense relief, he was not a shadow face. But my relief was short-lived when, after the rally was over, they cut to footage of his opponent. Some blue-blooded wasp asshole who had a reputation for being both a sneering elitist and a religious fundamentalist, who was distinctly not human. I felt my stomach turn over. God help us if that thing won the election. Thankfully, a few weeks later, it lost, but it was a close call. This raised another thought. I got on my laptop and began doing some research. I knew now that I could detect those things on TV, but would my brain be able to register them in photographs? I began checking out old photographs of famous historical figures going back to the beginning of commercial photography in the mid-1800s. Once again, I was blown away by what I had found. They had been around for a long time, at least 150 years. Several former US presidents, world leaders, rulers, noblemen, and royalty, along with celebrities from the 20th century, all now long deceased, had been shadow faces. Some rather infamous ones included Lyndon Johnson, Governor George Wallace, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, and Pol Pot. It wasn't just political figures or movie stars who had been shadow faces either. Several notorious terrorists, criminals, and serial killers, including Charles Manson, also hadn't been human. I closed my laptop, my hands shaking a little. Christ, how far back did this thing reach? How far down did the rabbit hole lead? And what the fuck was I going to do about it? I had a sudden brainstorm, an epiphany. I jerked back in my chair as if I had been shocked, wondering why I hadn't thought of it sooner. Dr. Steiner, the man who had performed the procedure on me that had been the cause of all of this. I knew he was human because I had seen him after the onset of the crippling migraines that had signaled the start of my second sight, or whatever you wanted to call it. I hadn't spoken to him in a few weeks, ever since he had run a CAT scan on me to try to discover the source of my headaches. But I had his number. It had been 6 months since my surgery, and I suddenly found myself wondering if he had performed the same procedure on anyone else since then. Other people who might be able to see them like Jeremy and I could. I had to speak to him. Now. I dialed his number, but it went straight to voicemail. It was going on 2 a.m. by then, so I figured he was probably asleep. I left him a message explaining who it was and that I needed to speak with him urgently, as soon as possible, and then hung up. I went to bed, and after an eternity, I finally managed to drift off to sleep, determined to call him in the morning and find out if there were any other patients who had undergone the same surgery I had and had reported the same strange migraines I had experienced. I didn't wake up until close to noon because I had been up so late the night before. I had to be at work soon and didn't have time to call Dr. Steiner. I cursed myself for sleeping in as I raced to get dressed for my shift, leaving my apartment knowing I wouldn't be able to call him until I got off this evening. I checked my phone on the drive to the supermarket, but there were no new calls or messages. Dr. Steiner hadn't called me back. I figured he was just too busy. My shift seemed to drag by, moving at a glacial pace. I didn't think it would ever end. I was on autopilot the whole time, not really paying attention to anyone or anything. My coworkers and friends noticed how distracted and agitated I seemed and expressed concern. I told them I was still recovering from the bug I had had the last few days. An eternity later, I punched out and drove home, forcing myself not to speed. I sprinted to my apartment, and the first thing I did was dial Dr. Steiner's number. Again, it went straight to voicemail. Frustrated, I threw my phone down and got on the internet, doing a search for him online to see if there was a different way I could contact him. I didn't have to search for long before I found something. A news article, dated only a week before. I read it, feeling a sinking sensation in my stomach, a feeling of utter hopelessness. I groaned in despair and lowered my head. The article's headline read, "Prominent neurosurgeon Carl Steiner, 67, dead in car accident." I read the article. Dr. Steiner had been driving home from the medical school campus one evening and the brakes of his car had failed as he was stopping at an intersection. He had slid through and been T-boned by a semi, dying instantly. The other driver had survived with only minor injuries. It seemed a little too neat, a little too convenient. I wondered if there was more to it. Dr. Steiner had been onto something with his radical new procedure that could restore sight in those who had experienced trauma to their optical lobe. Maybe those things had caught on and been worried, viewing him and his medical breakthrough as a threat. Maybe they had decided to take him out of the picture. I remembered the first shadow face I'd seen, that pretty blonde student jogging on the campus on that long-ago day last spring. I wonder if she had been one of Dr. Steiner's students. Some of you have probably been wondering if perhaps Dr. Steiner had known more than he was letting on, if perhaps he had been aware of those creatures and that his surgery would enable people to see them. Truthfully, I don't think he was, nor do I think he had any ulterior motives for wanting to restore my sight. I think he was as unaware as I was that his surgery would activate some part of the brain that normally lies dormant, unlocking some hidden sixth sense. After all, Jeremy hadn't needed Dr. Steiner's surgery in order to be able to see them. It had been completely unintentional. A random accident. I sat there in front of my laptop, feeling my last avenue of hope slamming shut before me. I realized I was truly alone. Dr. Steiner was dead, and Jeremy had told me not to try to reach him. These things were all over the world, some in positions of high power and influence. There was nothing I could do about it. I considered my options. I knew I was not a cold-blooded killer. What had happened the other night had not been premeditated. I had acted purely in my own defense, despite what Jeremy had told me what these things were up to. I knew I couldn't accept the lifestyle he had chosen and become some supernatural vigilante. I remembered him telling me that maybe I should just forget about the whole thing and try to ignore it. Try to live a normal life and pretend it wasn't happening. And for a while, that's exactly what I did. I went to work and tried to enjoy an average, carefree life. I hung out with my friends, indulging in my social life, drinking with the guys, going to movies with them, and trying to ignore the shadow-faced travesties masquerading as humanity that seemed to leap out at me, towering over me from the 30-foot screen. And even dated Nikki, the cute cashier I had a crush on. This went on for several weeks. As October became November and fall inched closer to winter, the weather gradually getting colder. Several times I encountered shadow faces, mostly in public, but on a couple occasions they entered the supermarket. I bagged their groceries nonchalantly, pretending I couldn't see their faceless black voids, couldn't feel their red eyes upon me like lasers. I actually became rather casual, even bored with the whole phenomenon. For all I knew, they were just trying to live their own lives, getting by in the world the same as us. Maybe sucking souls or life forces or whatever they were stealing was just something they had to do in order to survive. I told myself it wasn't my problem. It didn't concern me. This probably sounds callous, even heartless, but I told myself it wasn't like they were killing anyone who mattered anyway. Just the dregs of society, the cast-offs, no one anyone cared about. Again, that sounds heartless, but that's just how I tried to rationalize my inaction. How I tried to justify my cowardice. Then, in late November, just before Thanksgiving, I was sitting in the employee break room eating my lunch, watching TV. The news was on. A picture of a cute, smiling 9-year-old girl with heartbreakingly innocent eyes. She had been sleeping over at her friend's suburban home and had died from what the medical examiner had diagnosed as a brain aneurysm the previous evening. Her tearful, grieving parents were interviewed. "She was my little angel, the sweetest, nicest person you could ever hope to meet," her mother sobbed. Then it cut to the girl's friend, the one whose house she had been sleeping over at. I thought she was having a heart attack. I tried to save her by performing CPR like they taught us at school. The friend wailed inconsolably. She sounded like she was in tears, but I couldn't see any, and her hellishly burning red eyes or on the darkness covering her face. I got up and went to the restroom. I sat on the toilet, my head lowered into my hands, my eyes closed for 10 minutes. Against the darkness of my eyelids, the darkness that I knew so well, I could see the girl's sobbing, bereaved mother. In my mind's eye, her face seemed accused to me. When I got up from the toilet, I went to the mirror and stared at myself. There was a look of grim resolve on my face. I knew what I had to do. I couldn't run from it anymore. Couldn't pretend it wasn't happening. Gun laws are pretty strict in the city where I lived, but one of the supermarket employees, a Mexican guy named Carlos who worked unloading trucks in the loading docks, was a pretty intense-looking dude with a sketchy past and a lot of old gang tattoos on his arms. I approached him in private and asked if he could help me get a gun for home defense. He was pretty suspicious at first, probably thinking I was trying to set him up for a bust, but after I convinced him I was on the up and up, he hooked me up with an old associate of his, whose number I called that same evening to arrange a meeting. 3 nights later, I met Carlos's old associate behind a Dunkin' Donuts closed for the night. He made me lift my shirt to make sure I wasn't wired, and then led me to the back of his restored, pristine Plymouth Barracuda and lifted the trunk, displaying a wide and impressive array of firepower, from basic handguns to fully automatic and unquestionably illegal heavy caliber assault weapons. He showed me several guns, explaining how to load and operate them, telling me their various merits, etc. I finally settled on a Ruger Red Hawk 357 Magnum revolver with a snub-nosed barrel and 8-shot capacity. I paid him $600 in cash, and he chipped in 2 boxes of hollow point ammunition for free. The next night, I fashioned a crude silencer out of an 8-inch length CPVC pipe and some spray-in foam insulation, using a tutorial I found on YouTube. On my next night off, in early December, I left my apartment, wearing an overcoat I had bought at a thrift store with pockets deep enough to contain my gun and silencer, and began my first hunt. I walked the mostly deserted nighttime city streets for over 2 hours, looking at everyone I passed by. And then I spotted her coming out of a nightclub. At first glance, she appeared to be your typical spoiled little rich airhead who idolized Kim Kardashian and Paris Hilton and probably threw a temper tantrum when Daddy got her the wrong colored BMW for her Sweet 16. A vacuous, living Barbie doll with peroxide hair and so many Botox treatments, it was hard to place her age. She could have been 23 or 35. She was wearing a designer trench coat over a short denim skirt and a white t-shirt that said Princess in pink cursive writing. Her breasts were too large for her small frame to be anything other than implants. She exited the nightclub in the company of 2 other young, overly pampered rich bimbos. They said their goodbyes before parting ways. Her face rippled, then transformed into that of a shadow face. I followed her down the sidewalk, keeping my distance. I saw her turn down an alley. I looked around, saw no one, and removed the .357 Magnum, attaching the makeshift silencer, and then entered the alley after her. She was crouched over a 50-ish, unshaven, homeless man passed out against a brick wall, an empty bottle of cheap whiskey close at hand. She was leaning forward, toward his face as if to kiss him. "Hey," I said softly, conversationally. She spun towards me, her piercing red eyes burning in the blackness of her face like twin fires in the pit of hell. "Who the fuck are you?" she demanded shrilly. I didn't answer her or make some witty premortem one-liner like Schwarzenegger or Willis. I just raised the .357 and fired 3 times. The muffled report sounding like someone coughing into their fist. Her brains splattered onto the littered pavement behind her, and she crumpled to the ground without a sound. Her face, reverting back to normal, a wide-eyed look of surprise fixed upon it. 3 bullet holes in her cheeks and forehead. The homeless man stirred and muttered unintelligibly in his alcohol-induced slumber. He was still alive. I shoved the silenced revolver back into my overcoat pocket and fled the alley, pausing just long enough to grab the expensive handbag the shadow-faced woman had carried with her. I removed her wallet and phone, wiped the handbag clean of fingerprints, and threw it in a dumpster 4 blocks away, covering it with trash. I removed the cash from her wallet, and then dropped it and her phone down a storm drain. That was the first one I hunted. I went home and hid the .357 Magnum, which Carlos's friend had assured me was 100% untraceable, under my mattress and went to bed. Unlike the young man I had bludgeoned to death, I felt no sense of guilt or remorse over the female shadow face. In fact, if anything, I felt a deep sense of contentment and satisfaction, certain that I had done something that needed doing, that my actions were justified. I had paid evil unto evil and saved a human life in the process. I went to bed with a clean conscience and fell asleep without trouble, sleeping better and more peacefully than I had in weeks. The next morning, the face of the woman I had slain was on TV. She had actually been something of a celebrity, the socialite heiress daughter of a well-known record label mogul, and her murder made international news for a while. Large amounts of alcohol had been found in her system, and police speculated she had left the nightclub drunk, gotten disoriented, and stumbled into the alley where she had been robbed and murdered. The homeless man had been found, still unconscious, nearby and had been taken in for questioning, but police didn't believe he was a suspect. I went to work, feeling better and more at ease than I had in almost 2 months. I was upbeat, genuinely cheerful, and my coworkers noticed, asking me what the deal was, if I had won the lottery or something. I just smiled and told them I had finally made some much-needed changes in my life, leaving it at that. I watched the news every night after that. Police had no leads in the murder of the heiress. Several homeless people had died in an epidemic of what health officials suspected as a virulent new strain of pneumonia. I suspected otherwise. Over the rest of the winter and the spring of the next year, I killed 4 more shadow faces, 3 men and a woman. Each time I simply walked around the city until my new sense kicked in and I made a mark. Then I'd follow my target from a safe distance until they chose some secluded location to feed. Then I'd shoot them 3 times in the head, rob them, and take off. Twice, I was able to save their intended victims. Twice, I was too late. It didn't take long for them to suck a person's life out of their body. Their victims always seemed to enter a trance when they began to feed, and the 2 I was in time to save remained in a state of catatonia for hours, which the police believed to be a state of shock from witnessing the murder, unable to identify the shooter. 3 of the shadow faces I killed were well-dressed and from the top rung of the social-economical ladder: a lawyer, a fashion designer, and a financial analyst. The 4th one, who was actually the 3rd I killed, wasn't. He was an out-of-shape, blue-collared guy in the grimy blue coverall of a sanitation worker. I remembered what Jeremy had told me about how most, but not all of these things seemed to be rich. Some of them were passing themselves off as average people living normal, working-class lives. A couple times walking in the city during the day, I thought I spotted Jeremy in a crowd, but if it was him, true to his word, he always ducked out of sight after he noticed me looking at him. I didn't pursue him. I didn't care. He had told me everything I needed to know, and maybe he was right about how we should distance ourselves from each other for safety. A few times I heard on the news about murders I knew I hadn't committed and wondered if they were his doing. I wondered if he had connected me to the shootings going on, and if so, what he thought about my own killings. My upbeat demeanor remained. My manager, who hadn't seemed to like me very much before, commented on my positive attitude and actually promoted me to cashier. Not that it paid much more than a bagger, but I didn't care. I had never been religious before, and like I said in the beginning, God didn't appear to me in a dream telling me to do it. I had never even believed in God or demons before, given the shitty hand I was dealt in life and the misery I had endured. But right then, during that period, I felt a sense of righteousness, a feeling that I had been chosen by some higher power to do its work and vanquish the forces of darkness. This couldn't be random happenstance. There was a purpose to this. I was on a holy mission, a crusade, to rid the world of evil. I became convinced that God was looking out for me, that He would guide my way, provide for me, and protect me. I let it go to my head. And as a result, I made a very bad mistake. I forgot what Jeremy had told me about how he changed up his MO after each killing to throw the police off so they didn't link the murders. I continued to kill the shadow faces in the same manner, with the same weapon, and it didn't take long for the cops to notice a pattern and realize they were dealing with a serial killer. The media dubbed me Triple Shot Killer. I should have stopped right then when I saw the first news coverage. Should have thrown away the gun and lain low for a while. If I had been thinking clearly, I would have done just that. But I wasn't thinking clearly. I was too caught up in the mania of my quest to destroy these creatures, my head full of glory. I think subconsciously, I wanted them to know someone was onto them and wanted to show them they weren't as invisible as they thought they were. I think I was showing off. It was very foolish, very stupid of me. I let my ego get the better of me, and because of that, I slipped up badly. I got overconfident, careless, and reckless. It all came crashing down one warm spring night in mid-May. I was pursuing my sixth shadow face, a woman in her mid-40s dressed in a small pantsuit. I spotted her coming out of a law firm downtown. I believe she was a lawyer, and saw her face make that distinctive ripple that was the precursor to my other sight kicking in and locked on to her true identity. I followed her for over an hour as she made her way into a rather sketchy part of the city. A street that had once been lined with rows of adult movie theaters, back then those were a thing, most of which were now long gone, replaced with massage parlors, adult DVD stores, dive bars, and pawn shops. Some of the buildings had been long since abandoned, turned into crack dens by the resident junkies, and the sidewalks were littered with used syringes. Most of the businesses were already closed for the night, their entrances and windows secured with metal shutters. I didn't realize it, but I guess I wasn't as discreet as I had been on previous hunts. I got impatient, sloppy, and she caught on that someone was following her, but didn't let on. She slipped into the entrance of a long derelict movie theater. I presumed to search for some prey, and I stepped in after her. She was waiting for me inside, a can of pepper spray raised, but before I could react, she sprayed a stream of it right in my eyes. burning, screaming agony filled my eyes, blurring my vision. I shut them, howling, stumbling back. I heard her run off, screaming for help, for the police. I pulled my gun and fired after her blindly. Missing. I couldn't see, but I knew I had to get out of there, quickly. Luckily for me, I could navigate pretty well without sight. I had been blind for 20 years after all, and I managed to fumble my way out of the theater and down the street until I felt the entrance to an alleyway. I felt my way through, hoping it wouldn't lead to a dead end, stumbling over objects in my way, almost falling, until I came out onto the street on the other side. By then I could hear the wailing of approaching police sirens. I ran into a dumpster and quickly climbed inside, hoping there was no one around to see me. I hid there in the darkness of the dumpster, amongst the trash, the stench of rotting food overwhelming, for over 2 hours. By then, my vision had more or less recovered. My heart was pounding, and any second, I expected the beam of a flashlight to fill my hiding place and a voice to shout, "Freeze." It didn't happen, though. When I felt it was safe to leave, I finally emerged, covered with trash, soaked with disgusting liquids I didn't even want to try to identify, and began heading for my apartment. I wanted to run, but knew that would only attract attention. I forced myself to move at the pace of a casual stroll. I wasn't sure I'd make it back to my apartment, but I did.
Barnabas here with a brief reminder. If you're enjoying this series, don't forget to show your support for this fantastic author. You can find more of their work on Reddit under the username CarlB1961. They've got a plethora of great series for you to dive into, all of which can be found in the description and pinned comment of this video. Make sure you check them out on Patreon too, at CarlB1961 to show your support. Pardon my interruption, and let's get back to this incredible series.
When I got up the next morning, my eyes were still sore and red from the pepper spray that bitch had sprayed into them. The euphoric high I had been riding on the past few months was gone. I was shaken and disturbed by the events of the previous night. I thought about my botched hunt, the shadow face that had gotten away, and my near arrest. I had screwed up bad, and now I dwelt upon the possible ramifications. I wasn't worried so much that the shadow face that had escaped would be able to identify me. The abandoned movie theater had been dark, and she had only caught a glimpse of me. I was frustrated that my impatience and carelessness had allowed my target to escape. I worried that the other shadow faces in the city would find out. Maybe she'd report back to them or something, assuming these things had some kind of secret social network. And they'd realize for certain that there was indeed someone stalking their kind, if they haven't found that out already, and would become more alert, cautious, harder to track. Maybe they'd even start searching for me, hunting the one who was hunting them. I had been acting stupid, had gotten arrogant, and it had almost cost me my freedom, maybe even my life. I knew I couldn't risk being that sloppy ever again. The next time, I would have to be more on guard, more disciplined. I didn't realize it then, but there wouldn't be a next time. It was already too late. I went to work, irritable and sullen and withdrawn. My coworkers noticed my sudden change in mood, my silence and bloodshot eyes. One of the baggers who I'd become friends with, Carrie, made a lighthearted joke about me partying too hard the night before, and I snapped and blew up at him right there at the front end of the supermarket, telling him to shut the fuck up and mind his own goddamn business. He looked at me in wide-eyed shock. All of my coworkers and their customers were looking at me, shocked by my sudden angry outburst, which was a far departure from the normally easy-going, amiable attitude they had gotten used to from me. My fellow cashier, Nikki, who I had dated twice by then, was staring at me from her checkout lane with something like an expression of cautious fear, as if she was seeing a side of me she had never seen before, a side she had never even suspected existed. She looked at me as if I were a dangerous animal, a rabid dog that might suddenly attack. They all kept their distance from me the rest of the day, avoiding me. I didn't care. I was in no mood to apologize. I had too much trouble of my own to deal with. I left the supermarket when my shift ended that evening, not knowing that I would never see any of these people, my friends, ever again. When I got home, I cracked open a beer and turned the TV on. I watched it for about 30 seconds. Then the beer I was holding fell from my hand and splashed out upon the floor, foaming and hissing. I felt gut-punched. My knees buckled and I sat down heavily on my bed, staring at the screen in shock. My own face stared back at me. It was a police composite sketch of the triple shot killer that had been preying upon this city's elite since last winter. An intended victim had managed to escape and given a description of the subject, who had been responsible for at least 5 murders and maybe as many as 12. They were already lumping in Jeremy's own killings with mine, having noticed similarities, unaware that there were 2 different killers preying upon the city's upper-class citizens. The likeness was dead on. That soul-sucking bitch might as well have given them a photograph of me. She'd even been able to provide them with my hair and eye color. I didn't know how she did it. She couldn't have seen my face for more than a second, and it had been dark. Then I remembered she wasn't human. Maybe these things have supernatural eyesight or they can see in the dark. Who the fuck knows? I sat there for over an hour, letting the weight of it sink in. It was over. Truly and unquestionably over. Jeremy hadn't been there to bail my ass out like he had the first time. It was only a matter of time before someone who knew me, my coworkers or my neighbors who were familiar with me from seeing me around the apartment building, saw the sketch. My fellow employees would remember how irrational and erratic I had acted in the supermarket. They'd see the composite sketch and put 2 and 2 together. And then the police would come. Everything I had been building up for the past year, the new life I had established, my friends and career, was gone. Irrevocably lost. I thought about what I should do next, what my best options were. There was really only one thing I could do. I had to leave. To flee the city, right now. I packed the duffel bag Dr. Steiner had given me when I left the hospital after my surgery with the few possessions I owned, and left my apartment for the last time. I knew I would never return. I put my bag in the trunk of my car and got in the driver's seat. I drove away and parked in the underground garage of an office building across town. I sat there all night, wide awake, listening to the radio. They hadn't identified me. Yet. I wanted to leave town, but I needed money, and the bank was closed. I would have to wait until they opened the next morning. It was risky, and I knew every minute I stayed in the city I was in danger of being apprehended. But it was a chance I had to take. I couldn't use my credit cards or my bank debit card. That night lasted forever. When 9 a.m. finally came around the next morning, I drove to my bank and withdrew the rest of the cash in my checking account. I was tense, expecting any second to hear a police officer shout at me, commanding me to put my hands in the air and get down on the ground. When I had my money, I got back in the car and drove out of the city. Forever. As I crossed the bridge, I threw my revolver out the window, over the railing, into the river below. I drove north for hours without stopping. I listened to the radio. Police were close to confirming the identity of the killer who had been terrorizing the city for the past 5 months. They still hadn't released my name. I arrived in a different city I'd never been to before, over 300 miles away. There, I sold my car for cash at a used car dealership. After the transaction was complete, I walked down to a convenience store a couple blocks away and bought a pair of sunglasses. I went into the restroom, locked the door, removed my shaving kit from my duffel bag, and shaved my head at the sink. I made sure to throw all my hair in the trash and piled toilet paper over it. Then I put on the sunglasses. I used my phone to call a taxi and then threw my phone in the trash can outside, knowing the police could use it to track my location. I had the taxi drive me to the nearest bus station. I bought a ticket on a Greyhound for a city on the other side of the country I selected at random. And I headed west. The Greyhound arrived at my destination 3 days later. I got off. I was in a city in a state I had never been to before, on the other end of the country. By then, the police back home had identified me and begun a statewide manhunt. The first thing I did was buy a new car. I located a used car for sale from a private seller in a classifieds magazine and bought it the same day, paying cash and using an assumed name. I stayed in the city for a week, living in a cheap motel off the interstate and eating at fast food joints. I watched the TV carefully. Back in the city I'd used to live in, the police commissioner spoke at a news conference. The triple shot killer was believed to have fled the state, and federal authorities were about to launch a nationwide manhunt. Several of my former coworkers were interviewed, expressing shock at the secret other life I had led. "He looked like such a normal young man to me," Casey, the older cashier I'd been on good terms with, said with a look of disbelief. "Just a normal, easygoing guy. I guess you could never tell about some people." Next, they interviewed my former bagger friend, Carrie. He was acting pretty sketched the day before, like he had something to hide. Blew up at me for no reason. I thought maybe he'd got some bad news or something. I guess he did. In local news, a young woman who had been in the hospital recovering from the removal of a benign breast lump had died unexpectedly from what her doctor diagnosed as sudden cardiac arrest that was believed to have been brought on as a side effect of the pain medication she had been put on. He was interviewed, expressing sadness and regret at her untimely death. He was a shadow face. I turned the TV off, shuddering. I woke on the 8th day feeling anxious. I felt a sense of impending doom, an intuition that I had stayed here long enough and if I remained I would be pushing my luck. I left that same day, with no particular destination in mind. I drove out of the city, careful to obey the speed limit and traffic laws. I made sure both of my taillights were working in advance. I was driving an unregistered, untitled vehicle, and my driver's license had the name of a wanted murder suspect on it. If I got pulled over even once, I knew I was finished. There's not much more to tell. If you've been following my trial, you should already know the rest. I spent the next 7 years driving across the country in a random pattern, never staying at a new place longer than a couple of weeks. I lived as a drifter, a nomad. Occasionally I'd find work doing odd jobs and through various day labor organizations, temporary jobs that paid cash, to make money for gas or food. I'd travel to a new city or town, stay a little while, work, and then, when I sensed that I was in danger of being recognized, when I had a premonition that my enemies were closing in, I'd move on to someplace new. I had a couple of close calls. In Des Moines, I left a construction job I'd been on for about a week and drove out of the city less than an hour before the cops arrived, having received a tip from someone that I was in the area. I changed my appearance and my name constantly to avoid detection. It wasn't just the authorities I was afraid of finding me. They knew who I was by then, and I could sense they were hunting me as well. I continued to hunt them whenever I felt I could get away with it. They were everywhere. Everywhere I traveled, I saw them. They weren't as common out in the country and rural places as they were in the cities, but there were always at least a few there, too. I killed them whenever I could. Sometimes I'd capture them alive, bind them, and drive them out to some secluded location. An abandoned house, a barn, the basement of a deserted building. And I'd torture them first, trying to get information out of them. Trying to get answers to the question I was always asking myself. What were they? Where had they come from? What were they planning to do? They never answered me. No matter what I did to them, no matter which body part I cut off or burned. They just stared back at me defiantly with their burning, red, soulless eyes, seemingly impervious to pain. Sometimes they'd even laugh at me. I never disposed of the bodies. I always left them to be found, as a message to the others of their kind. It was because of the brutality of these murders that I developed such a horrific reputation through the press. My victims were all ages, sexes, and races. The hardest was probably a 12-year-old girl in a private school uniform who I lured into my car in a suburban neighborhood just outside Cincinnati, using a pretense I don't even remember now. I took her to an abandoned industrial complex on the outskirts of the city, splashed her with gasoline, and threatened to light a match if she didn't talk. She didn't give up her ruse, didn't break her act the whole time, crying and acting innocent, telling me she didn't know what I was talking about, telling me she wanted to go home to her parents, begging me to let her go. I felt a brief stirring of uncertainty in my heart, maybe guilt or sympathy, but I squelched this feeling and remained stoic. I set her on fire and watched as she burned, screaming. I know, it sounds horrific. I know I sound like a sadistic, heartless monster, a brutal, twisted psychopath, but you have to remember, these things weren't human, even though they might have fooled everybody else, including their family and friends. I knew what they really were. Monsters. Demons that preyed upon societies weak and forgotten and ignored, sucking out their life forces or souls or both. I coped with it by telling myself that even if that thing had really been a normal young girl at some point, it wasn't anymore. And if there had still been a trace of the real her, a shred of her human consciousness or soul or whatever you want to call it trapped inside her shell by the thing that had taken her over, I had released it, set it free. And I'd love to tell you that I was doing it all for purely altruistic reasons, that I was on a noble quest to save the world and rid it of evil, but that would be bullshit. I think I was mostly doing it out of revenge. These fucking things had destroyed my life and ruined any chance I had at a living, normal existence. They had turned me into a cold-blooded killer, had forced me to abandon my life, my home, and the people I knew, to become a wanted man on the run, constantly looking over my shoulder in never-ending fear of capture or death. I wanted to make them pay. In Phoenix, I encountered something that scared me quite badly, something that, until then, had been unique to me. An entire family of shadow faces. A couple who looked to be in their late 30s and 2 young children. Either Jeremy had been wrong about how you never saw more than one in a family, or they were multiplying faster than he had suspected. I followed them in my car from the shopping center where I had spotted them to their pleasant middle-class suburban home. I returned late that night and broke into their house. I learned how to bypass home security systems, and I killed them in their beds, one by one, while they were asleep. By that time, I was on the FBI's 10 most wanted list. In addition to watching the news religiously, I also read the newspapers. In Baton Rouge, I read an article that made my heart sink like a lead weight. I felt numb. Back in the city where I had used to live before this nightmare had begun, police were investigating a bizarre, grisly murder that had happened a few days prior. A young man named Kyle Beaumont had been brutally tortured and murdered in his own apartment. His eyes had been removed and nailed to a wall. Below, a message scrawled in his own blood. A cryptic message that baffled the police. A message I knew had been left specifically for me. Your friend Jeremy sends his regards. I stared at the photograph that accompanied the article, stared at the face I clearly recognized from that long ago night in the park. An awkward-looking young man with a thin face and short black hair, haunted eyes magnified by the lenses of his glasses. I let the newspaper fall from my hands and flutter down to the floor. I was trembling. They finally caught me in Salt Lake City 10 months ago, only a few hours after I arrived. I arrived that night and checked into a cheap motel, intending to repeat the process of staying for a few weeks, finding temporary work and hunting down any shadow faces I encountered, as I had a dozen times before. I'd replaced my vehicle several times over by then, always dumping it where it wouldn't be found, usually by pushing it into a nearby body of water when no one was around, and then buying a new one from a private seller in the classifieds, always paying cash. I was augmenting my irregular day laborer and construction income with the cash I took off my victims. When the tag expired, I would just steal a current sticker off the plate of a car parked in a long-term parking garage, and then replace that one with a different sticker I stole off a car in a different parking garage so it wouldn't be noticed so soon. The license number on the sticker didn't match the one on the plate, of course, but that wasn't something anyone would notice from a distance. By then, I was driving a white 2003 Chevy Express cargo van where I kept the tools I used to interrogate and dispatch the shadow faces. Pliers, blowtorch, assorted knives, hammers, saws, flares, gasoline, etc. Sometimes I even killed them in the back of the van itself and then dumped their bodies where I knew they would be found. In hindsight, I guess that was a pretty stupid choice. I changed my appearance yet again, dyeing my hair gray and growing a goatee, and gave the motel clerk a new fake name I had come up with while driving to the city. I felt reasonably confident he wouldn't recognize me, and under normal circumstances, he probably wouldn't have, except for plain bad luck and timing. What I wasn't aware of was that the clerk had just seen an episode of America's Most Wanted, profiling yours truly and his illustrious career as the most notorious serial killer in the 21st century, which is probably too premature a title to bestow upon me. It's still early and who knows what sickos might come out of the woodwork before this century's over. He spotted a small but distinctive scar high on my forehead, a souvenir of the beating that robbed me of my sight as a child, and that was all it took. He played it cool and didn't let on, taking my cash and giving me my room key. He waited a couple hours, allowing time to make sure I was asleep before calling the police. I went to my room without even the slightest inkling that I was fucked and that my long run had come to an end. I entered my room, which was really no different from the scores of other cheap motels I had stayed at during the past 7 years. A single bed, tacky paintings on the wall, stained carpet spotted with cigarette burns, a TV distantly, muffled by the walls. I could hear music pulsing from one of the neighboring rooms. I was able to identify the song and it made me grin rather morbidly. An old 70s song from a group I never listened to, the Talking Heads. The song was called Psycho Killer. How appropriate. I tossed my bag down on the bed and turned on the TV. I watched it, deeply disturbed by what I saw. They were on all of the channels, hundreds of them, more of them than I could ever remember seeing before. I could swear some of the actors and actresses in the movies I saw on the cable channels, who had been human before, were now shadow faces. I switched to the news and stared at the pompous, smug son of a bitch who calls himself the president, making a speech, his red eyes smoldering in the dark recesses of his shadow face beneath that ridiculous blonde toupee he wears. I switched the TV off, thinking. I felt a deep surge of utter hopelessness. They were increasing rapidly, much faster than I had anticipated. The cities were crawling with them now. Every time I was in my car driving down the streets, I spotted them. in crowds and in stores and shops and businesses and driving their own cars. It wasn't just mostly the affluent anymore either. They were infiltrating the working class too. Construction workers and maintenance workers and sanitation workers, fast food clerks and street vendors and security guards and postal workers and even the police. For the first time, I wondered if what I was doing was making any difference at all. I didn't think it was. There were too many of them, and as far as I knew, now that Jeremy was dead, I was the only one standing against them. Jeremy's words from that long ago meeting echoed in my mind. What good can two guys do fighting these things on their own? Except now it was just one guy. Me. I wondered if it was possible the shadow faces I had already killed, some 40 of them, might just be finding new human hosts to possess. How could I ever hope to get ahead on my own? Even if everyone was aware of what was going on and banded together to defeat them, what good would that accomplish if these things could just find new bodies? I went to bed and fell into a troubled sleep. What seemed like only minutes after I had drifted off, I was awoken with a start by a jarring commotion. The sounds of splintering wood and shattering glass. I bolted upright in bed and found myself blinded by a dozen flashlights mounted on a dozen high-powered rifles, aimed at me by the dozen large men wearing SWAT armor and helmets that surrounded my bed. "Police, don't move!" a voice bellowed. I wanted to believe I was having a nightmare, but I knew I wasn't. It was over. Simple as that. "Put your hands up!" the voice demanded. I complied. Resigned. I was brought first to the city police station to be booked. My fingerprints and mugshots were taken. Then, when they had confirmed that I was who they suspected I was, they drove me, hands cuffed, ankles shackled, in an armored van with a half-dozen police deputy escorts to the county jail where I was taken to a special cell. The story had broke and the media had arrived in full force, cameras flashing, reporters hurling questions as I was led into the building. I was under constant supervision both by the police and the CCTV cameras that monitored my cell. I sat there silently, calmly awaiting whatever came next. I was taken several times to an interrogation room where I was questioned, first by the police and then, when they arrived, the FBI. I held nothing back. There was no point in denying anything. They knew who I was and had all the evidence they needed in the back of my van. I confessed to everything, answering their questions calmly, even directing them to the locations where several of my victims who had not yet been recovered could be found. The only thing I didn't tell them was my motive. What was the point? All the people I spoke to were, thank God, human, but they wouldn't believe me. Looking back, it probably would have been to my advantage to tell them the truth. At least then my lawyer could have copped an insanity plea and I might be able to avoid execution. But that probably wouldn't do me much good in the long run. I'd still be in prison for life. Days passed. I was arraigned, then driven by federal marshals to a maximum security federal prison to await my trial. I was kept in solitary, away from the general population. I've garnered something of a reputation among my fellow inmates. They have mixed opinions of me. I've received something like rock star status from some of them who idolize me like a celebrity, a hero, because most of my victims were rich fat cats. Other inmates want to kill me because several of my victims were children. I'm kept away from them for my own safety. I can't help but smile at the bitter irony of it. Now I know how my dad must have felt before he got a shiv stuck in his throat. I've even received fan mail from people rooting for me in my crimes, women who want me to father their children. The world's a crazy place, isn't it? Psychiatrists and psychologists have interviewed me. I tell them about my childhood, my life, and the killings, but not why I did it, not even when they press me. They each have their own theories and opinions as to what drove me to do it. Some argue that I did it out of class resentment and anger, or because of my abusive childhood. They argue that the brain damage I endured from the beating as a child affected my conscience, my ability to tell right from wrong. Some even argue that the brain surgery Dr. Steiner performed to restore my vision impaired my mind somehow. That one's probably as close to the truth as any of them. There's not much more to say. The verdict is tomorrow, and I have a good idea what it will be. And the sentencing? Lethal injection. I sit there in my orange jumpsuit in the courtroom, feeling the burning red eyes of the 12 shadow-faced jurors, and the shadow-faced prosecuting attorney, and the shadow-faced judge on me, blazing with vengeance. I don't think I'll even make it that far. They are in the correctional system too. Shadow-faced inmates and COs. I think they have something much worse in store for me after I reach death row. But I'm not going to give them the satisfaction. I would tell the world what was going on, tell them the truth, even if most of them dismissed me as a madman, if only to reach the few others like me who might be out there in the world listening. A rallying cry to the troops, so to speak. But journalists are not being permitted to interview me. Still, I have a way to get this story out, to the few who might read it anyway. I'm not supposed to have internet access, but I bribed one of my human guards with some cash I smuggled in on me. Don't ask me how. And he agreed to provide me with a tablet for an hour a night for 2 weeks so I could write all this down and post it on Reddit no sleep, a little at a time. I'm almost finished now. There's really nothing left to say. Except, like I said before, I'm not going to give those soul-sucking, shadow-faced motherfuckers the satisfaction of doing me in themselves. You see, tonight I slipped the guard a little extra and bribed him for something else I'm not supposed to have. A razor blade. To the families of all of my victims, I apologize for all of the grief and suffering I have caused you. But I don't apologize for my actions. I know you all hate me, and will rejoice at my death, and will probably feel cheated by my suicide of seeing me rot away on death row for years to come. Will feel robbed of the satisfaction of witnessing my death firsthand from outside the chamber, looking through the glass at me strapped to a gurney. You'll probably think I'm a coward for taking the easy way out. I'm not asking for your forgiveness or understanding. I just want you to realize your loved ones were already dead long before I got to them, replaced by something that looked and sounded and acted like them. But wasn't them. Was in fact something far more terrible and evil than you can imagine. To all of you out there reading, know this. This is all real, and these things are out there, walking among us, feeding upon us, lurking in our society, invading our civilization, spreading and growing in number. Their influence goes all the way to the top. They've infiltrated the highest offices of our government. Some of them might even be people you know and love and trust, maybe even someone in your family. Maybe even someone you sleep beside every night. I don't know what their ultimate goal is, but whatever they're planning, it can't be good. So I guess this is goodbye to all of you who have followed my story and read it this far. I'm going to be shuffling off this old mortal coil, as some writer or another put it, and plugging into the blackness. But I'm not afraid. After all, I know blackness all too well.
Welcome back, my darling deviants. I so hope you enjoyed this thrilling tale and came away with a better sense of the world around you. Kind of makes you wonder about those that you've been molding your life around, am I right? People just aren't what they seem. And that's why I hang around with monsters. What you see is what you get. Except for Al. He's invisible. But he's got a heart of gold. I know because I can see it. Oh, be sure to annihilate that subscribe button, ring that little bell, and we'll see you in the next video. Until next time, my ghastly gang, stay spooky.